Release that witch eye by Ermo. Chapter 861, The Redwater Plot. On the 10th day of the expedition, they were at Redwater River. Roland was in quite a heroic mood as he stood at the front of the shallow water gunboat, looking at the sparkling river in front of him. Behind him was a huge fleet, and despite the fact that some of the ships had turned eastward 3 days earlier, the remaining 10 steam-driven paddle steamers remained a rare sight on the river. The chimneys, standing like a forest of iron, were painted in a striking snow-white color, and the black smoke that erupted created a dark cloud over the river. After entering the central region of Grey Castle, there were significantly fewer vessels, which meant that the kingdom's trade center was moving westward. However, the influence of several major cities in the central region was present. Compared to the many single-masted boats in the western region, most of the sailboats that were found here were more exquisite and beautiful. All the merchant ships that they encountered along the way kept their distance. Bold sailors would lie on the ship's side and point to the flagship of steel, exclaiming endlessly. The captain or businessman who recognized the high tower and spear's flag would even bow and salute the vessel. Roland was very satisfied that he could amass so much after 3 years. But he was even more gratified about these young officials who were brought up by the city hall. They did not have a lineage of 100 years, nor did they have a rich and powerful family background. They just had a short-term universal education and a mastery of literacy. If this was the past, at best, they could only work for the nobles by doing some miscellaneous administration for a living. But in Neverwinter, they gradually became the backbone of all the departments. Because of the lack of patronage, the new generation of officials fully supported Roland. Other than him, no one else would use normal civilians that had no status. Because they had never held any management posts, they would act cautiously in accordance with the rules and regulations. When they encountered any problems, they would make the effort to ask their superiors for help and would not be arrogant or conceited like the nobles. As they were selected from ordinary subjects, they were used to carrying out tasks on their own. The Ministry of Agriculture officials led the farmers to grow wheat, and the officials of the Ministry of Construction demonstrated the characteristics of cement to the new workers. This scene was a common sight in the city. A powerful, centralized government needed to have strong control over the people at the grassroots level in order to exert its vast and efficient potential. This action by the civilian management was exactly what was needed. Of course, the civilians that jumped to the management level did not come without flaws. Just like a poor man who had never owned property and suddenly came into fortune, it was easy to fall into the trap of greed and short-sightedness. The level of education at Neverwinter was not high, so they probably would not possess personal standards and professional ethics. Fortunately, there were Nightingale and the Internal Review by the Security Bureau that could effectively curb this tendency. After several screenings and severe punishment, those who remained in City Hall had understood the limits of His Majesty. The ever-growing number of young officials had become Roland's guarantee of expanding his own power. It could even be said that his plan to regain the kingdom was based on the number of officials available. Now, he finally had the foundation for unifying the country. Notify the advisor department to go to the observatory for a meeting. Roland turned toward Nightingale. How should we go about taking over Redwater City? It's about time that they come up with a plan. In fact, it was not the first time that the Neverwinter fleet visited Redwater City. As early as 6 months ago in the Tooth Extraction campaign, the First Army had visited this central city. The advisor department's opinion was reasonable. Your Majesty, Redwater, in terms of the central region, is considered second only to the Old King's City. Not only does it own a vast territory, there are also many nobles. I'm afraid we can't force them to hand over their power like what we did with Willow Town. Sir Eltec, Morning Light's father, further elaborated by saying, Earl Delta, the Lord of Redwater City, isn't an ambitious man. This can be seen from the city's tax revenue. He could easily request for more as he controls the intersection of the inland rivers. The Delta family had managed this area for several generations. Even if they gave up their manor, they would still have a comfortable life. As compared to rebellion, the Earl would certainly know how to make a wise choice. But this doesn't mean that the other nobles will follow suit. It's by no means easy to consolidate their opinions, especially the Tri-River and Rock Ridge families. It's rumored they're not on good terms with Earl Delta. He pointed to the map and said, and once your claim is officially proclaimed, it's likely that this will bring the opponents together similar to what had happened in the western region before, so we speculate that the First Army may have to fight and force them to surrender their power. Of course, this isn't bad. Destroying rebels can reduce the trouble for the management later on, and your great strength will certainly deter the rest of the misfits. So we suggest that you summon Earl Delta alone to convince him before announcing the decree, although those nobles should more or less already know about your intentions. If someone disobeys later on, you can just send troops to clear them out. Roland nodded and silently looked at the map. He did not mind using military action to persuade his opponent. The First Army was used to doing that. However, Sir Eltec's words, just like what happened in the western region before, gave him some concern. The time he had spent to eliminate the 5 big families took a lot longer than the seizing of Long Stronghold and King's City. The reason back then was that the area of a fief had been far larger than that of a city. He had to take a few extra days just for a detour. Redwater City had an even larger matter around it compared to the western region cities. If he really wanted to clean it up, it would take more than 2 to 3 weeks, plus the subsequent placating measures. Isn't there a faster way? Well, Your Majesty, faster means. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Later on, there'll be several other cities. If they all require such measures, by the time we get to Coldwind Ridge, half of the summer would have passed. The Earl and the others were silent for a moment. There's a method, but it might be detrimental to your reputation, muttered Edith suddenly, bring them together and announce to everyone on the spot. Oh? Roland looked at her. Go on. I've encountered a similar problem, but it was even worse, said Pearl of the Northern Region, and then she gave a detailed account of her plan to eliminating the Haas family and Lista family. I'm afraid that if I'd followed the tradition of the nobles, and had declared before taking action, the Northern Region would have still remained in their hands. After listening to her plan, the staff of the advisor department could not help but gasp. Your Majesty, this. It's hard to be convincing without evidence and trial. If it gets found out, I'm afraid that it'll bring suspicion from the other nobles. Have you forgotten that there should be no other nobles in Grey Castle other than His Majesty? Edith said flatly. No trial was needed when the former nobles dealt with civilians. She turned toward Roland and said, but it depends on whether you want to carry it out, after all, reputation. Only the victor is qualified to write history, Roland interrupted her. For example, if you don't say anything, no one will know you've done something like this. I have to thank you for your trust in me, and anyway, this matter won't be found out. As for the takeover of Redwater City, let's follow your idea. He then saw a strange glimmer in the latter's eyes. At that moment, the Pearl of the Northern Region's breathing seemed to quicken. However, she quickly masked her unease and bowed her head. As you wish, Your Majesty. Chapter 862, Obstacles. In his mansion in Rock Ridge, Earl George Neri finally received the letter from the Western Region. He unsealed the letter and glanced over it, his face clouding over. What did it say? Asked a restless baron. On his chest, there was a cayman of God of River, indicating that he was from the Levitan family, whose domain was located at the intersection of river courses and was regarded as a fairly famous family in the local area. There were over 20 nobles like him in the study room. Nearly half of the feudal nobles around the Redwater City had gathered here. Instead of answering him immediately, George glanced at him coldly and handed the letter to Guy Urian, the Earl of Tri-River. After the latter read through the letter, George began to speak slowly. Roland Wimbledon has taken away all the power of the Willow Town Lord and occupied his domain as well. The new king really did it? Hell. So what does he want to do? To deprive us of our titles just as the news we received has suggested? How can he do that? That title is passed down from my grandfather. Someone suddenly said, Willow Town is too close to the stronghold and it's very small. It doesn't mean that he'll do the same to Redwater City, does it? I guess he didn't seize the entire king city before us because he doesn't have the capacity. Maybe we should wait. Hearing that, George could not help sneering in anger. He said, to the western region, is Redwater City farther than the city of Evernight? Are your domains larger than the whole northern region? Are you blind or stupid? It's not news that Roland Wimbledon wants to take away the power of all nobles. You see what happened in the northern region. The businessmen have hinted it repeatedly, and now the Willow Town provides the best example. And now you're wondering whether you will be the next. Please mind your language, Your Excellency. His mean and rude remarks made the nobles frown. Let me explain, said Guy, waving his hand toward the Earl of Rock. In fact, I believe everyone is aware that our new king is definitely not an ordinary person. Since he went to Border Town, everything he has done is beyond imagination. So it's meaningless to judge his actions by the old standards and your past experience. I have sent my men to the western region. Roland Wimbledon doesn't conceal his real thoughts. He plans to abolish the nobles' feudal power and just reserve their titles. This has basically become his mission of his ruling, and the slogan has been openly put up in the city square. His calming voice eased the mood of the nobles. He continued to say, you may say that Redwater City isn't his domain. But the Longsong stronghold wasn't his either, let alone the northern region. Roland Wimbledon will be the king of Grey Castle sooner or later. When that day comes, even if he claims that the whole kingdom is his domain, what else can we do other than accept it? And that will definitely happen. After a short pause, Guy said, if we lose our domain and subjects, what else do we own? But what can we do? Huff, another baron, interrupted impatiently. King Timothy was defeated, so was the church. Who else can stop him? Last time when the Western Region army came to Redwater City, we saw how they fought. Within 60 meters, the snow powder weapon is irresistible, and even heavy armored knights can't approach. How can we resist such power? Hearing that, the crowd chimed in. Of course there's a solution, George said in a cold voice. Although the snow powder weapon is powerful, it has some flaws. It can only be used in an open space. The bigger space, the more powerful. But when in a confined environment, its power is limited. A confined environment? The Lord's castle, for example, he said word by word while glancing at the nobles who were present. When Roland Wimbledon arrives at Redwater City, he'll definitely live in the castle. Only a few guards can live there, so as long as we can arrange more men there, we'll be in an advantageous position. Did Lord Delta agree to cooperate with you? Levitan asked in surprise. You know his personality. It's impossible for him to do such a thing. Even if he was pointed by a sword to his neck, he would not resist, said George, shaking his head dismissively, but he really did me a lot of favor. In the castle, there are lots of secret paths which lead to the outer city area. As long as we send our people in the castle ahead, they won't be found. How did you know it? Thanks to Earl Delta, he likes to dig here and there in the city, and I bribed the masons for the information. As the saying goes, a crafty person has more than one hideout. I don't know whether he's cautious or timid, George sneered and said, I originally planned to kill him in this way, but I think it'll work just as well on Prince Roland. But this is treason, Huff muttered, and if Roland Wimbledon were killed, his army would likewise flatten us. Who said we're going to kill him, replied George, knocking on the table with displeasure. As long as we seize Roland, we can have the situation under control. Since the new king is alive, his army won't dare to put his life at risk. Maybe we can even force his army to retreat. Once the news spreads, those nobles will definitely side with us. Don't forget, the Western region is the only domain he's truly had his hands on. When that day comes, it's hard to say whether the Duke of the Northern region will still support him. But after all, he is. He hasn't been a real king yet, Baron Huff. Guy Urian interrupted him, he hasn't held the coronation, nor did he proclaim himself as a king. We can select another Wimbledon, who believes in aristocracies and follows the traditions, as the king. We'll find such a man in the King's City as long as we try. By that time, maybe someone will stand out before we look for him. George lowered his voice, and we should know how much we'll benefit from this. Losing everything or glorifying your family, what are you hesitating about? His words immediately caused a stir among the nobles. Obviously, they already knew what they should choose. George Neri was not surprised by the result. The nobles he summoned had been in favor of Timothy before. Even if Timothy was dead, they would not choose Prince Roland, with whom they had a conflict of interests. Further, the prospective benefits were enough to tempt this group of cowards to take a bold action. However, their ability was limited. If no one led them, they were nothing but a rabble. He was the only qualified person to assume the post of the Lord of Redwater City and run the central region. After a moment, Levitan and his party seemed to have made their decisions. They asked, "What are we going to do next?" "Put some of your reliable knights under my command." "Then, just wait," George said with confidence. Chapter 863, A Prelude. 2 days later, the fleets of Roland Wimbledon arrived at the pier of Redwater City. Earl Delta, who had received the message earlier, took the matter very seriously. At his command, the pier was not only thoroughly cleaned, but was also decorated with eye-catching satin and banners. On the day when Roland arrived, Earl Delta led the nobles outside the city gate and greeted Roland in the suburb. He was much more enthusiastic than he had been upon the arrival of the First Army earlier. As the great nobles in the central region, George Neri and Guy Urian were naturally among the greeting crowd. He had to admit the new king's presence was indeed impressive. It was not the first time for George to see the steel ship named after Prince Roland. However, after seeing it again after half a year, the ship still shocked him in the same way as it had done before. Following it, concrete ships were neatly lined, much more than last time. Their snow-white chimneys and heavy smoke seemed to reach to the sky. When he saw the soldiers who wore uniforms of the same color walk down the pier, he could not help admiring it. If he had such an army to serve for the Rock family, it was not impossible for him to fight for the throne in the royal palace of the king's city, not to mention Redwater City. This fool. I really don't know how he smartened himself up. George spatted and said, "When I was in the king's city about 5 or 6 years ago, he was obviously the stupidest one. He was totally incomparable to his elder brothers. Even his little sister, who had scarcely been out of the shell back then, was much better than him." "Doesn't that mean that Prince Roland is the most sophisticated one?" said the Earl of Tri-River, shrugging. "Since he can develop the border to such a degree and overshadow all of his siblings, he's definitely not a fool. Remember to smile and show your hospitality." "Of course I know," George replied carelessly. "After all, he's a member of the royal family. Even if he's a fool, I'll do my best. Rest assured." "That's great." At this moment, a loud horn sounded in the direction of the pier and a stir was aroused in the crowd. He knew that Roland Wimbledon, the ruler of the western region, or the new king of Grey Castle, showed up. "How's your preparation going?" George asked under his breath. "I've already sent 51 men to the castle," said Guy, who remained still in his position, pretending to be eager to see the arrival of His Majesty. "In 2 days, I can send the rest of them." "Me too," said George, smiling faintly, "so we still have lots of time. Then we'll have a bigger chance." He had talked with Guy several times what Roland would do after he entered Redwater City. Roland was most likely to reach an agreement with Earl Delta before he announced to forfeit their feudal power. After all, Redwater City was a large city and there were lots of nobles with domains around it. Therefore, it was impossible for him to act as quickly as he did in Willow Town. Since Delta was indecisive, it might cost him several days to make up his mind. And then it would take another few days before the news spread and the other nobles responded to it. During this time period, George could fill the secret pass with a sufficient number of his people without being noticed. Then when the bell at midnight tolled, their men would rush into the castle all together. The snow powder weapon would be useless. Since they had more people they needed and they were in a favorable geographical position, it would be impossible for Roland Wimbledon to escape. "He's coming," Guy reminded George. George immediately put on a smile and stepped forward. Among the greeting group, the first row was the family members of Earl Delta, and the second row was great nobles like him. Earl Delta stood beside the new king and was introducing the nobles with a flattering smile. When George saw his round face with his broad grin and quivering double chin, he could not help having a bad turn in his stomach. He still remembered that the Earl had been the same obnoxious toady when Timothy the Second Prince had led his army into Redwater City. "Your Majesty, this is the Lord of Rock Ridge, Earl George Nary." Delta finally walked to him. "I'm greatly honored, Your Majesty," said George with his most cordial tone, pressing his chest with his right hand and bending deeply. "Rock Ridge has the most fragrant tea and fruit wine. It'll be my great honor if you can pay a visit." "Really?" The reply from Roland took George by surprise. "Where's your domain?" As a ruler, shouldn't he say that the honor is his and that he would pay a visit at his convenience? George thought, but he quickly replied, "Just on the east of Redwater City. 2 kilometers to the east and behind the first mountain you see is the domain of the Nary family." "It sounds like a nice place. I hope you'll treasure it," said the new king, who patted him on the shoulder and smiled. "Treasure it? What does he mean?" George frowned without Roland noticing it. Without betraying his suspicion on his face, he replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." Nothing out of normal happened during the greeting ceremony. After everyone met Roland, Earl Delta announced that he would hold a grand banquet at the lakeside villa. Then he ordered the knights to clear the road ahead and escort the king to the city. Everything went as planned and even a little exceeded his expectation. The new king's army did not rush into Redwater City. Instead, they were stationed in the pier area in the suburb. Roland was followed by less than 100 guards. When they lived in the castle, about 20 guards would be able to guard outside his bedroom. He was certain about the result. However, he felt a little restless out of no reason. Roland's smile seemed to be weird. He could not tell the reason, but he could not help feeling an ineffable chill looming over his heart. George shook his head and put all the thoughts behind. "Maybe I was wrong," he thought, "even if he's brooding on something, they'll be meaningless the moment he entered the castle. When he's in my hands, I'll talk with him about what happened earlier. By that time, I won't have to try to please him, and he'll not be in a mood to show such a strange smile." The night fell. Everyone in the city knew that the last prince of the Wimbledon family was in Redwater City. As he was most probably the king of Grey Castle, the whole city celebrated it. The vast inner city was as bright as the day, so was the lakeside villa. It had always been the place to entertain distinguished guests, and the dining hall, which was built above the lake, was linked with Redwater River and supported by dozens of hundreds-year-old larches. A trestle-like corridor led to the shore and there was even running water in the hall. To please the new king, Earl Delta spared no effort in bringing all the seasonal gourmet food in the surrounding area to the table, and some of them were something George first laid his eyes upon. However, he did not pay much attention to the food. In addition to Roland Wimbledon's action, he had to also keep an eye on those nobles who supported the Lord of Redwater City. After the new king showed up in the dining hall, George could not help frowning. All of those guards around Roland turned out to be women. Chapter 864, An Announcement. George silently counted and found that there were altogether 10 women. The number did not exceed what the royal family was allowed to have. Among them, 6 were guards, wearing short robes and leather pants for convenience. As soon as they entered the hall, they scattered and each took a position at a corner. It was not surprising for a lord to keep some female guards. Actually, George also kept 2 in his mansion. He did not really expect them to fight but just had them for fun, especially when he went hunting in the wild. It always aroused him when he took off their seductive leather armor and cleaned their feet landing on top of them. But it was weird to bring them on such a formal occasion. In terms of physical strength, women were born to be weaker than men, and the gap between them was insurmountable. Therefore, most outstanding guards and knights were men. Except for having fun, no one would bring those women guards who were mere eye candies. Not to mention the appearances of these women were so unbearable. George was not picky, but he believed that these women would be kicked out even in some low-grade brothels in Redwater City. From their homely faces and rough skin, he guessed that they were about 30 or 40 years old. Wrinkles and dark spots spread nearly from their foreheads to chins. They had a slender figure due to long-term exercises, but their faces really turned any men off. Did Roland Wimbledon have such a special taste? However, when he turned his eyes to the woman holding the new king's arm, he immediately repudiated his previous assumption. That was a gorgeous young woman who looked perfect from every angle. Her lake blue eyes were like crystal gems and attracted anyone who looked at them. No doubt they were the most beautiful eyes George had ever seen. Once she entered the hall, the crowd fell into silence for a moment. Even the appearance of Edith Conte, the pearl of the northern region, had not created such a stir. If the girl had not stood beside the new king, she would definitely have been surrounded by most of the nobles in the hall. The last two women were veiled. It seemed that they did not want others to see their faces. That was rare at a banquet, though acceptable. If you did not want to be seen, you could choose not to attend it. Dressing in this way would attract more attention. Have a drink? Guy came over with 2 glasses of wine at the moment. Thanks, he took the glass, followed him to a corner of the hall, and asked, "Did you notice anything?" "The woman beside Roland is a little weird," whispered the Earl of Tri-River. "Don't you think she's too gorgeous?" "Did you notice that too?" George touched the god stone of retaliation in his pocket and whispered, "I guess, she's probably a witch." "I also think so. If she were from any noble family, it's impossible that we had never heard of her." It was not a secret that Roland recruited a lot of witches. News of this kind spread from the king's city to Redwater. At first, the news only spread among the rats, but then after the king's city was occupied and the church was defeated, more and more people talked about it. The new king did not publicly proclaim his attitude, but people gradually stopped persecuting witches, as no one dared to go against the new king regarding this matter. However, few nobles took the recruitment seriously. In their opinion, a witch was like a woman guard. She would be kept for appreciation, and be used when they had special needs. After all, witches were renowned for their beauty. Even during the period when the church and Timothy were hunting down witches, some people would hide witches at risk of their lives. Nevertheless, it was not understandable as to why Roland brought a witch to the banquet. Did the constant victories make the new king lose his head and start to act recklessly in his private life? Or was he really serious about the woman? George immediately denied his second guess. Witches were infertile. That alone made it impossible for her to be his wife. Perhaps he brought her to the banquet on a whim. However, that was good. When Roland was in his hands, this was undoubtedly excellent evidence of his crime. He could blame Roland for ignoring the noble traditions, and even for insulting the ladies who came to the banquet with the nobles. Of course, the criticism would not affect a royal family member much but would definitely incriminate that witch. As for how to punish her, of course, it would be decided by him. Earl of Tri-River apparently also had the same thought. He grinned and said, "You can't have her alone." "Of course I won't forget you, old friend," said George, raising his glass. "I'll surely let you take the first shot." They looked at each other, and could not help laughing after a moment. The banquet went well. After drinking a toast with the new king, the nobles with similar titles gathered together. The men talked about their recent hunting, harvest and affairs, while women talked about their delicate silk garments and luxurious jewelry. George Neri was also surrounded by lots of nobles. At least it appeared that his supporters were no less than that of the Lord of Redwater City. Some people who had been on the fence also started to approach him, as they had apparently heard the rumor that the king was prepared to abolish their feudal power. George had more confidence now, and his previous inexplicable uneasiness gradually faded away. That was right. He had enough time. Roland Wimbledon, after all, was an outsider, and he had to make exponential efforts if he wanted to make any changes. However, the Rock family had been living here for hundreds of years, so he was naturally at a geographical advantage. This advantage became even more palpable when Roland appeared to be reckless and arrogant. Now George even believed that they could directly capture the new king just with the guards of his and those of the Earl of Tri-Rivers, as well as Levitan and other nobles. However, after thinking for a moment, George gave up this idea. After all, the lakeside villa was an open space and was hard for them to hold. They also have difficulty in transferring troops, so it would be more appropriate to carry out his plan when Roland lived in the castle. Just after 2 days, the young king would be a caged bird. Please be quiet. Just then, Earl Delta suddenly clapped his hands and drew everyone's attention to the center of the hall. He said, "His Majesty wants to tell you something." George put a piece of juicy spare ribs into his mouth and thought, is he going to make the closing speech? Finally, the banquet is over. First of all, I would like to thank Earl Delta for preparing this sumptuous banquet. I'm also pleased to see so many people be invited here, said Roland, looking around the hall with a smile. If I remember correctly, nearly all the nobles around Redwater City have come? Seeing his smile, George could not help feeling a chill. He thought, it's that smile again. A fake smile. His smile simply hanged his lips. What's he thinking? Except for 2 who are ill, the rest of the invitees are here, Your Majesty, Delta nodded. Well, I'll take this opportunity and tell you directly, said Roland slowly, with his hands behind his back. From now on, Redwater City and the domains around it will belong to me, the King of Grey Castle. It won't be conferred in the future. In other words, he paused and said, none of you will be hereditary nobles any longer. Chapter 865, Mind Reading. W.H. at? George blinked. For a moment, he couldn't believe his own ears. Looking at Earl Tririver next to him, he saw that the Earl was bewildered too. At that moment, all the nobles' expressions resembled Guy's. The room was shocked into silence, so much so that you would have been able to hear a pin drop in the room. This wasn't a part of the plan. Could this mean that Roland Wimbledon has already persuaded Earl Delta? He then looked at the Lord of Redwater City and his assumption was immediately dismissed. The Earl was no calmer than the others, and with his eyes wide open, he looked at the new king with disbelief. Obviously, he did not expect the new king to have this plan up his sleeve when he himself was the one who invited the guests over to the banquet. To Delta, it was only routine to be attending the banquet in Lakeside Villa. As was the same for the others. This is just Roland's selfish move. Is he mad? I think most of you have noticed that the feudal system has severely hindered the flow and specialization of personnel, which in turn has restricted the development of our nation's productivity. Considering that Grey Castle, and even the entire human race may soon fall into a major crisis, I have to make this tough decision, which is to take back all the land and power in your hands so that people in the Grey Castle can work as one. Specialization of personnel? Productivity? Major crisis? What the hell is the guy talking about? Who understands those things? George thought and swallowed hard. Yet the new king seemed not to care about the nobles' opinions. He kept on talking as if there was no one present. For the moment, I believe that this decision is both right and necessary. Take the western region and the northern region of Grey Castle as examples. The disappearance of feudal nobles didn't cause chaos in the 2 regions but instead brought them order. The unified Neverwinter decrees, planning, and deployment of policies have propelled the city into the industrial age, with large factories taking over from household workshops as the workhorses of production. At the same time, a large amount of wealth has been created, and people who actively participated in this process have benefited greatly. These are undeniable facts, and I think you can all see it. With that said, I don't mean to eliminate the entire noble class. I just want to tell you that losing your manor and the title doesn't mean you'll lose everything. In this new system, you will gain better, more abundant opportunities. Imagine a cake the size of your palm. Although you might be able to barely satisfy your hunger if you swallow it all, if you were to enlarge that cake to the size of a table, you will have more than enough even if you only get a slice of it. Since this reform is beneficial to both you and your subjects, it shouldn't be hard to understand why we want to make it a comprehensive reform across the kingdom. Many of you must have heard of the reform, right? Indeed, many nobles know what you're up to, but they didn't expect you to be so impatient. George thought quickly. After the initial shock, he gradually regained his composure. To his surprise, he found that this accident was not necessarily a bad thing. and it might even be favorable for him. It was almost impossible to reach a consensus with the amount of nobles present. On the contrary, it would aggravate the pre-existing conflicts between them and the new king. George was happy to see that the king's talk actually saved his effort to make himself look good in front of all those present. After all, compared with making his move after persuading the Redwater City Lord, what the new king did was too reckless. This could quickly push those who previously wanted to support Earl Delta to his side. As expected, when the nobles came to their senses, one of them said, "Your Majesty, I'm not too familiar with the situation in the western and northern regions. Would your Majesty be so inclined to give me a couple of days to decide? Yes, this matter is of utmost importance and would decide the fate of my house. I can't make the decision on my own. Your Majesty, can you guarantee that each of us will get more wealth? What if the reform fails? If we lose our lands, doesn't it mean that even the original small cake would be lost? Your policy must be wise and brilliant, but I'm not a merchant, Your Majesty." "That's right. There we go," George gloated. The more questions they throw towards the new king, the more insightful he himself would appear. If Roland were unable to assure the nobles of his reformation plans, he would be stuck in quite an awkward spot. Roland, however, kept his unwavering facial expression. After the crowd rambled on for a while, the king raised one hand and silenced the room. "You seem to be misunderstanding something. What I just said was not a suggestion but an order. Did you think that you had any say in this to begin with?" His tone turned less friendly and colder. "I don't even need your consent. I'm fully aware of who'll stand on the wagon of progress and join me, and who'll act as the stubborn rocks blocking the wheels just to be crushed into dust." "How, do you know that?" Earl Delta said with surprise. A smile crept up Roland's face. "Because I can read minds." "What, did you say?" "When faced with things beyond your comprehension, it's normal to be suspicious." Roland turned over, signaled to Edith, then said, "In that case, I'll demonstrate it to you." The Pearl of the Northern region nodded. She smiled to the nobles and said, "His Majesty's ability can be easily proved. As long as you repeat every word that I say, you'll understand it instantly. No lie can escape the detection of His Majesty's mind reading. The Wimbledon's rule of Grey Castle depends on the mastery of this ability. I want to make it clear that anyone who doesn't repeat after me will be considered as one of those rocks to be crushed." "Nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. There's no such a thing as mind reading. It would have been more credible if a witch had said that." George Neri retorted in his heart. Wearing a godstone of retaliation, he was not afraid of the bewitchment of any evil force. He wanted to call for the other nobles to help him put a stop to this farce, but he found that many nobles in the crowd looked like they were going to go along with Edith's suggestion. Many believed that they would have nothing to lose even if they tried, so they were actually waiting for Edith to continue speaking. George was not sure whether they were waiting for the king to make a fool of himself or were afraid of openly offending the king. Edith smiled. "Everybody, please listen carefully. The first sentence is, I completely agree with His Majesty's new policy, and I will willingly cooperate with the officials dispatched from Neverwinter." The nobles repeated carelessly, a few even failed to hold their laughter, feeling that what they were doing was rather ridiculous. "None of you are telling the truth." Roland gave his judgment. "Although a little regretful, it's actually understandable. If it were me, I guess I also wouldn't have easily believed in the king who had stayed at the border area of Grey Castle the whole time." "Please continue." "Wait a minute. Something's wrong." George frowned. Would any king accept this result so calmly? Being the Lord of Rock Ridge himself, although he was aware that not every one of his subjects was sincerely obedient to him, he never would want to hear that right to his face. Shouldn't he be embarrassed and annoyed? Why is Roland Wimbledon so calm? The second sentence, Althaut, I don't understand what His Majesty wants to do. The feudal power isn't something I can't live without. I am willing to cooperate as long as the opportunities for me to acquire more wealth exists. Edith licked her lips and said in high spirit. Please repeat after me word for word. Do make sure to speak clearly. Chapter 866, Smashing a Glass. Things took a sharp turn after Edith's second question. Four nobles were escorted out of the crowd by the new king's guards. The crowd began to stir. Your Majesty. What? You guessed right. The four of them were telling the truth, Roland said with his hands laid out. Their courage and their willingness to try earned them the qualification to come aboard my wagon. What we need for a reform is people who dare to try. He then turned to the chosen nobles. Do your best. Don't waste this opportunity that has landed in your hands. Yes, yes. Your Majesty, the four nobles said, feeling somewhat flattered. Nonsense. George could not help but growl in his heart. Courage? Qualification? You must be kidding. Those guys are nothing but barons who are on the verge of going bankrupt. They are titled to nothing but barren lands with pathetic yield, poor management, and a lack of manpower. The output of their lands can barely make ends meet. So of course, they won't have a problem giving up on their lands. The lands under these nobles are but symbolic. Upon losing the lands, they won't even be invited to the banquet. People like them actually got the new king's special attention? Or, perhaps they've colluded with Roland Wimbledon to put on this absurd show? Wait a minute, he suddenly recalled an unsettling story that came from the king's city not too long ago. There were only a few witnesses to this story about Prince Roland. It was said that after taking over the king's city, the prince held a trial in the Holy Palace for those great nobles. Judging from the result, almost all the nobles who had controlled real power in the king's city had been swept away. Even Timothy was not spared. He had been sentenced to death. Rather than a trial, it would be more fitting to call it a purge. The proceedings of the trial were extremely bizarre. He heard that Roland had convicted the nobles with a Q&A game. The nobles had been asked to answer 10 questions. If they responded to any question incorrectly, they would be sent to prison. It was said that this seemingly ridiculous rule was due to mind reading. Back then, George didn't heed this rumor any mind and had considered it a story fabricated by the nobles who had luckily escaped punishment to conceal their guilt and cowardice. He firmly believed that this so-called mind reading was just Roland judging the nobles based on his personal preference, as he would never spare the former king's ministers. But now, George was not so sure about his original judgment anymore. Could the rumors be real? Here comes the third sentence. Listen carefully, Edith's voice sounded once again. I have no intentions of giving up my land and power, but in front of overwhelming power, I wouldn't want to lose my life over them either. She gestured to the crowd. Now your turn. The atmosphere in the hall changed. Those who initially repeated after Edith carelessly were now filled with mixed feelings after they saw the first batch of nobles being escorted out the crowd after earning the new king's recognition. This time even the timing of the responses were off. Yet the guards still picked out more nobles. To George Nary's surprise, Earl Delta was also among them. What's going on? Guy quietly moved to George and asked with a low voice. Does this mean the new king has persuaded them? George did a head count. Altogether, 21 nobles had been chosen, among whom a few actually discussed with him the plan to fight against Roland not long ago. Without those nobles and their servants, the crowd was downsized to half. I'm impossible. If Roland had contacted so many of them, I would have noticed. George gritted his teeth. They must have been chosen on the spot. Then, why didn't they say so? Baron Levitan also scooched closer to George. That guy Huth was still with us in the beginning. What? George glared at him. My lord, you have wronged me. My lands are more important than anything else. I'd rather die for it. Would you say something like that? What an idiot. Georgie thought angrily. The point here isn't the nobles who are being chosen, but those left behind. Roland Wimbledon could just close his eyes and pick anyone as his follower, then suppress those who are left behind. But how could he make sure those who support the Lord of Redwater City instead of himself aren't left behind? If he chooses wrongly, it will only push those who have supported him to the opposite side. Such a trick has no other meaning than giving the nobles a warning. Or, could he just wanted to show off his mind-reading skill? Looking around, once again George made sure that the new king only took 6 guards with him. Even though only 1 or 2 nobles were left behind and the new king wanted to punish them as a warning to the others, these 6 guards most likely would not be enough to control the crowd. At least, he and Earl Tri-River would not sit idly by and do nothing. Submitting before power is nothing to be embarrassed about, smiling at the second batch of chosen nobles, Roland said. Since ancient times, the powerful have ruled the weak. Being able to size up the situation correctly and act correspondingly is no less commendable than having courage. Your ancestors were able to take over a spot for themselves in Grey Castle and even continued their bloodline instead of getting forgotten through the passage of time. This achievement alone is a proof of their capability. I'm glad to see that you all have inherited their wisdom. Moreover, I promise that you won't be treated differently from the previous batch of nobles. I only hope you remember what you said today. When you have to make similar decisions in the future, just make sure to keep in mind the might of Neverwinter. Then he looked at the Pearl of the Northern region. Next sentence. Edith nodded. The 4th sentence, I don't want to give up either of them and I don't know which to choose. This sentence was very short. However, from amongst the remaining nobles, only 5 or 6 of them repeated it. Most of the others chose to be silent, perhaps because they had noticed that they were being differentiated. Among those who repeated, the guards only chose 3. Ahem. Your Majesty, we believe that you can read minds. So let's call it off now. Yes. After all, this is a welcome banquet. You see, Earl Delta and Earl Tri-River tried to appeal to the king one after another. There are fewer neutrals than I've imagined. But Roland acted as if he did not hear them. Being irresolute and hesitant can't actually be counted as positive characters, especially so when facing the tide of reformation. But you still belong to the category that is reformable. Why don't you guys stay here for now? You will probably change your mind in a moment. He paused, then said to the remaining nobles, here comes the last sentence, but I'm guessing that you already know what it is about. In this case, I'll spell it out for you myself. No matter what, I'll not hand over my lands or power. For this purpose, I am willing to take a risk. As long as I can defeat the king, my house and fortune will live on. In a split second, the hearth seemed to sway without any wind. Nobody in the hall dared open their mouth. The air felt icy cold. It doesn't matter even if you don't speak. As I said before, this isn't a suggestion but an order, Roland spoke slowly. People who don't repeat will lose their qualification to get on my wagon. Your road ends here. What do you mean? George scowled. How can you convict us without any evidence or a proper trial? There were still 27 nobles remaining, which was far more than George had expected. According to their titles, each had 2 to 4 attendants with them. So altogether, there were more than 60 people left, some of which were probationary knights. What good would it do for the new king to corner us like this? Doesn't he worry about backlash from the nobles? Your Majesty, if you're just kidding, I think it's already gone far enough. Guy still managed to keep his kind face and said patiently, your last sentence carried the joke too far. We can't say it out. How can you be sure that's what in everybody's mind? At least I myself will never betray the Wimbledon family. That's true. I'm wronged. I've never thought about anything like that. Your Majesty, please reconsider your words. The nobles were shouting out their pleas one after another in loud voices. You know what? Mind reading works in such a way that the more you talk, the better it becomes. Roland was not swayed. He took over a crystal glass from Edith. You can save your words for the shovels and oars. Oars? That's right. You'll be escorted to the North Slope mine to labor for 20 years in punishment for your conspiracy. After all, you haven't actually acted against me. The new king then spoke in a dangerous tone, but, if you resist my verdict in any way, your conspiracy will become treason. When that happens, you'll be sentenced to death. Roland drank the wine in his glass with one gulp, then tossed it. The glass traveled along an arc before it fell at George's feet, where it shattered into pieces. Arrest them. Chapter 867, A Meaningful Smile. Insane, this guy is absolutely crazy. George Neri could hardly believe that the relation between the Redwater nobles and the new king would deteriorate to the present state. He just could not understand why the king would assume that the nobles would allow themselves to be seized without putting up a fight. The new king brings only 6 female guards to fight against more than 60 people. Does he really believe that his guards are as hard as nails? Though he's supported by the witches, they can't guarantee victory in front of the nobles that are wearing the god stones of retaliation. Immediately after Roland gave an order, one of his guards went to the door while another one stayed with him. The remaining 4 all drew their daggers and approached the nobles step by step. All the nobles and their men unsheathed their swords. None of them wanted to put down their weapons and surrender to the king when they themselves significantly outnumbered the king's guards. Your Majesty. The lord of the Redwater city looked pale. Everybody calm down. If you've any issues, we can discuss it. Unfortunately, it was too late. George exchanged a knowing look with Guy. They decided to change their plan and fight in this villa. Although this place was hard to defend, it was still good for them to take action here since most of the Redwater nobles were gathered in this villa today. George believed that seizing Roland here would quickly swing them to his side, just like Prince Roland had said, strength decided everything. But unfortunately for the prince, the Redwater nobles were the more powerful side in the lakeside villa. I can't accept it. Guy shouted and then walked out of the crowd, holding his sword in his hand. This seemingly amiable man looked irritated now. I can't say anything if this is a judgment based on valid evidence. Please excuse me for being blunt. Nobles should never be trifled with. Even if King Wimbledon III himself had asked me to do this, I would have refused him. Your Highness, you forced us to act this way. All the 4 tall guards following Earl Tri-River held their heads high, stood unyielding and unafraid in front of the new king. They seemed to be more impressive than the king's attendants. Well done. Being a noble himself, the royal prince can't deny this high-sounding rhetoric. It's both inspiring and provocative. Now, all we need to do is catch Roland and we will have the final say. George thought to himself. The new king would surely not have expected that this old man with gray, grizzled hair would turn out to be an excellent fighter. Guy Urian was born with supernatural strength. At the age of 15, he had led 2 knights and managed to eliminate a band of robbers based near the river estuary. When he had reached young adulthood, he had mastered all kinds of weapons and had been unrivaled in the fighting matches between the nobles. Some people called him Guy the Giant and firmly believed that he would have been remembered as one of the strongest knights in history if he had not been born a great noble. Moreover, each of his 4 servants qualified as a probationary knight. If they were engaged in combat with the king's guards, Roland Wimbledon would not be able to escape from Earl Tri-River by himself. Go and help him, and keep an eye on Miss Edith, George told his attendants. Yes. A few more people stepped out of the crowd. Guy strode toward Roland, who smiled even more merrily now, seemingly undisturbed by the ongoing tension. The Earl could not help but clench his fist and thought, go ahead and laugh. This is your last chance to be arrogant. Next, you'll be so shocked that you can't even cry out your fear. Attack. Guy dashed forward and struck his sword at the female guard beside Roland when the Earl and his men were only 10 steps away from the new king. His strike was so powerful and fast that people around even heard the whistling sound of the sword cracking through the air. No one could dodge this attack. It could only be blocked. Once the guard evaded it as they had expected, Roland would be left unprotected. Clang, sizz. George heard 2 consecutive sounds. The former was a clear, melodious collision sound of metal weapons, and the latter sounded like a blade cutting through flesh. A piece of broken sword shot into the air while spinning and then got thrust into the wooden floor. Soon the head of Earl Tri-River hit the ground too. It slid smoothly to one side and then fell from his neck, bouncing twice on the floor before stopping. The blood from the wound left a bright red trail behind it. What happened exactly? Did someone just behead Guy the Giant and break his sword in half with just one strike? how's it possible? Before George recovered from the shock, the crowd began to stir. Clashes of swords and awful screams were everywhere. The broken sword was like a signal for the 4 female guards to simultaneously launch their attacks from different directions and start this bloody fight. George was terrified when he realized he could hardly follow those guards' movements through the naked eye. Their strength was very impressive too. Anything in their hands could be used as a lethal weapon. They were nothing like human beings and could even hurt people with just their fists and fingers. The nobles felt as if they were fighting steel warriors. Monsters. There are a group of monsters. No mortal body can be that strong, he screamed in his heart. But, if you make any rebellious action, your conspiracy will become concrete facts. When that happens, you'll be sentenced to death instead of ending up in the mine. He suddenly remembered the new king's words. It was like a bolt of lightning flashing across his mind. Maybe he was waiting for this moment? He turned his head with some difficulty to look at Roland Wimbledon. An unstoppable chill crept from the soles of his feet up to his spine. At this moment, he finally understood the meaning behind that smile. This is definitely a trap. The new king deliberately left the first army outside the city except for about 100 guards and took only 6 guards to this banquet. He pretended to be tough and uncompromising only to lure us into attacking him. He threatened to send us to some mine. No, he lied and had no intention of letting the remaining nobles live. He would have been really disappointed if we had decided to surrender. That's it, that's a smile of expectation. He was waiting for us to walk into his trap step by step and was amused to see us digging our own graves. This is a vicious smile. That's why I can't sense even the slightest bit of happiness in this cold face. Spare our lives. Your Majesty, I surrender. Me too. The Levitan family pledges their allegiance to you. I'll give you whatever you want. Please spare me. The situation was deteriorating rapidly for George. Though the remaining nobles still significantly outnumbered the king's 4 female guards, they knelt down to beg for mercy as they were the ones that seemed to be at a disadvantage. George dropped his sword helplessly. The nobles had already exposed their intention to rebel and overthrow the new king the moment they had drawn their swords. Disobedience, discontent, fear, and anger kept going back and forth through his mind, and then all the feelings dissolved into nothingness when a long sword struck him on his back. The sounds of fighting and begging faded away. The last scene he saw was a sloping hall and a pool of blood that rushed toward him. Chapter 868, The Black Pearl. This feeling is so great. Edith took a deep breath while savoring the tang of blood in the air. She was intrigued by the panic spreading among the crowd. The gods' punishment witches were rapidly tightening the ring of encirclement. The so-called resistance lasted only for a short period of time. For the tequila survivors, these nobles were no different from the common people that had no titles, and they would never hesitate to kill these self-satisfied common people who had no magic power. Edith was clear that they killed those nobles because another common person ordered them to do so. She was also confident that under the influence of this common man, these gods' punishment witches would also follow her commands, even though she was just a common person like him. This was the charm of power. Through bonds and negotiations, a common person could manipulate people's interests, goals, desires, and aspirations to create a force which was much more powerful than his or her own strength. When the last rebel was struck down, number 76, Phyllis, dropped her sword which had many breaches now and reported to Roland. Your Majesty, the filtering procedure is completed. The floor was littered with over 60 corpses. Their blood solidified into dark red blocks, looking like red wax in the flickering light of the bonfire. There was a dead silence. All the remaining nobles clenched their teeth and were afraid to make any noise. None of them wanted to become the next corpse. All the 3 unsteady nobles had already collapsed to the ground and were trembling with fear. Even without Nightingale, Edith herself could guess the replies of the remaining nobles if they heard the same question again at this moment. Fear was a guarantee of loyalty. And none of the nobles killed in the filtering procedure was innocent. During the first half of the banquet, Isabella had wiped out all the effects of their god's stones of retaliation in order for Nightingale to use her lie-detecting ability. By doing so, she could make those nobles believe that Roland had a mind-reading skill. The biggest mistake of the dead nobles was that they had overestimated themselves. These great nobles who had wielded absolute power over thousands of subjects turned out to be vulnerable in the face of greater power. The new king took back over half of the domains around the Redwater city through this fight. As compared to such a great achievement, Edith thought her success in eliminating the two great noble families in the city of Evernight was not worth mentioning. Fortunately, this plan worked. His Majesty had shown her enough trust, and the witches had followed her commands. The king had even adapted all the 5 statements she had composed without changing a word. The only thing different from her original plan was the glass cup he had tossed. She did not understand why His Majesty had insisted on sending the signal by dropping the glass. Judging by common sense, she believed that this step would have been unnecessary, since this action would have been noticed by the enemy and the sound of it would have been drowned by some other noises. She had doubted this decision and had considered the preparation of the wine and glass as a waste. However, together with the lie about Roland's mind-reading ability, she realized that smashing the glass had indeed constituted a mystery atmosphere which had really scared the nobles. She had to admit that the king was better at tactics. She licked her lips in excitement. Choosing to serve Roland Wimbledon was really a right decision. With this thought in mind, she could not help looking at the king and was hoping to share with him the joy of success. However, she failed to find any excitement in his face and could even see a vague attitude of exclusion and boredom in his eyes. "Is there any other banquet hall in this villa?" Roland asked in a deep voice. "There's one next door," said Earl Delta, swallowing hard. "Let's move next door. I've something to say." He nodded. "As for these insurgents, please ask your men to count and make a name list for me. I want to see this list, tonight." "Yes, yes. Your Majesty. By the way, please open all the doors and windows in this hall and get rid of these dead bodies as soon as possible. This smell of rust is really disgusting. I'll send my servants to take care of these things right now." "I see." Pearl of the Northern Region thought in her heart. The king was not looking forward to this massacre. What he desires is a city managed by a well-operating city hall when the nobles relinquish their power. For the king, killing is just a more effective way to intimidate the bystanders as compared to sending the rebels to the mines. Now it seems that he doesn't like killing and even gets disgusted by the smell of blood. Her excitement suddenly died down. She even started to doubt herself. Was my plan too cruel? If I had killed half of the rebels inside the hall and the other half outside, would it have looked any better? Though it was largely a matter of personal preference, she was still afraid that such a difference in attitude between her and the Dominator with regards to killing would block her advancement in Roland's government. When everyone moved to the hall next door, the new king finally stopped knitting his brows. He cleared his throat and said in a cheerful voice, "Don't worry. Only the insurgents would be severely punished and their rebellion has already been suppressed. Now the top priority is restoring the order of the Redwater city and I need your help to do this. Your Majesty, please let us know what you want us to do." All the nobles knelt down together. Roland nodded with satisfaction. "Please get up. This is the first task I am giving you. Now that you've returned your manners to the kingdom, it'll be meaningless for you to stay in your previous domains. I hope you'll gather in the Redwater city. This includes letting your freemen, serfs, and their livestock immigrate to the city, and not just the members of your mansions." "But, Your Majesty, where can we find enough food for those people if they all move to the city?" Earl Delta felt that he had no choice but to voice his objections. "And we don't have that many fields around the city, if you're planning to make them work the land. I'm afraid that we may cause famine and riots if we drive them into the city. First of all, you'll get new wheat seeds called Golden Twos. The yield of this kind of wheat is 10 times higher than that of normal wheat. Secondly, what Redwater City can't accommodate can be moved to the western region. I'll take in all of them, no matter how many they are." All the nobles gasped in astonishment. 10 times higher? Is there really such a kind of wheat? But our subjects. Roland interrupted, when you give up the fiefs, those people will naturally no longer be your subjects. They can decide to stay or leave by themselves. The efficiency of land usage in the past was too low, and all your lands were sparsely populated. A domain which was nearly 7 square kilometers could only support several thousands of people at most. Such a widely dispersed population is extremely inconvenient for the implementation of policies. Therefore it's inevitable to compress and move the people into certain big cities. I know you're still uncertain about the reform, but I can tell you it's the exact reason for the prosperity of Neverwinter. Don't worry if you still don't know what to do. I'll send some people here to teach you how to profit in the upcoming change. Teach us? Earl Delta stuttered. Yes, some officials who've been well trained in the City Hall of Neverwinter will come to build a new administration system here to replace the former lords and manage these regions for me. You can join them to gain power and status, but by doing so, you can only get limited salaries. Alternatively, you can seek opportunities in the development of mass production to create endless wealth for yourselves, but if you choose to do so, you won't be allowed to interfere in government work and will have to follow all the government decrees and finish all the tasks given by City Hall. Roland explained slowly. You don't need to make a hasty decision. This managing department will be set up tomorrow. You can consult them first before making a decision, but keep in mind that whichever choice you make, you'll achieve much more than the value of a piece of land. Half an hour later, the nobles started to leave the hall. Roland heaved a sigh of relief. Now the situation in the Redwater City is stabilized. And next, we're going to the Silver City and the Old King's City. We've finished the filtering procedure in the latter, so all we need to do is send some officials to manage it, said Edith. I wonder how everything's going in the Eastern Front. He looked out of the window and saw a bright moon hanging in the sky and the glassy surface of the lake shimmering with silver light. If nothing goes wrong, Iron Axe will arrive at Valencia tomorrow. Ugh, probably, said Edith. When thinking about what she had told Iron Axe before the battle and how the king had reacted to the bloody killing today, she felt her heart suddenly skip a beat. She was somehow unsure of herself now. I hope that everything goes well. Roland shrugged. Go back to the advisor department. You still have lots of work to do tonight. According to the plan, after getting the name list of the insurgents, the First Army would go to clean up these rebels' domains at night as quickly as possible. That was why the troops had been stationed outside the city. Yes. Your Majesty, I'll excuse myself. Edith replied absent-mindedly. By the way, he suddenly spoke when she was at the door of the hall, your plan was very clever. Good job. Good job? Did I hear that right? His Majesty didn't mind what I did. At that moment, Pearl of the Northern Region felt an unprecedented sense of gratification. She suddenly realized that her worries were completely unnecessary and this was actually a correct choice for her to gain greater power. As His Majesty did not like these devious plans and tricks, he needed someone like her to do this stuff for him. This was exactly the part she was adept at. Edith bowed her head to salute the king and then quietly walked into the darkness. Chapter 869, The Eastern Front Offensive. That's Valencia? Iron Axe adjusted his telescope and was observing a city which looked gray and brown in the distance. It should be Valencia according to the map. After all, there's only one San Juan River. We can't get it wrong, said his lieutenant, Beerpaw. Like Iron Axe, he was also a former hunter living in Border Town and among the first batch of Roland's militia soldiers. It looks a little weird, Iron Axe frowned. Why? Valencia is a major city in the eastern region and a well-established trading center of Grey Castle. Together with the Old King's City and the Eagle City, they formed the most thriving central region of the kingdom. I heard about its name even back in the southernmost region, said Iron Axe, but don't you think it's weird we've seen very few merchant ships here these days? I've no idea about this, Beerpaw shrugged his shoulders and said. The previous pirate attacks might have terrorized the merchants, so they might not dare to come here to do business again. The attack happened 2 years ago. No matter how much damage it caused, the merchants should have recovered from the shock by now. The city wall looked mottled and bloated. It seemed to have been thickened recently, but probably because of the lack of stones, they just plastered up the original brown wall with some red mud mixed with a lot of gravels and wooden materials, making it look like the early rubble wall in border town. In addition, the surface of this city wall was covered with a layer of glittering things. Because of the distance, Iron Axe could not clearly discern what they were. However, it was obviously not a comprehensive reconstruction of the city wall. The plastered wall sections now were twice as thick as the old wall, but some other parts still remained the same as before. Looking from a distance, it seemed rough and bumpy and looked nothing like a construction of a city famous for its wealth. Who cares? No matter what, we must occupy this city. Beerpaw fished out a fire lantern fruit and threw it into his mouth. His Majesty ordered us to capture the whole eastern region, so we have to seize every city we see in this region, even if it's not called Valencia. Hearing that, Iron Axe helplessly shook his head. Beerpaw was still a short-tempered person as he had been in the past. Once he had set his target, he would go for it with a javelin in his hand, and when he had returned with his capture, the other hunters would still be busy with setting traps and sending hounds to stalk their prey. It had been said that even the most ferocious animal in the forest, the black bears, would have been reluctant to confront him. That was how he had gotten his name Beerpaw. Iron Axe believed that Beerpaw would have been promoted to a position higher than a lieutenant if he had learned to use his brain. Even Banner was already the commander-in-chief of the artillery battalion. Beerpaw continued. But what matters isn't the battle itself but how to restore order after it. If we mess up the eastern region, City Hall will certainly find fault with us. However, if we don't resort to violence, it'll be hard for those officials to control the situation here. Did His Majesty tell you how to deal with these cities? Iron Axe was a little surprised by Beerpaw's thought. No, His Majesty just entrusted me to make decisions depending on the situation. That's a real headache for you. But you're the boss here and I'll follow your instructions. Beerpaw grinned. Iron Axe was intrigued. Oh? What do you mean by this headache? You really don't know, or are you just testing me? Beerpaw leaned his palm against his brow. You're definitely going to have a headache when you have to think about how to deal with those nobles. They've held this land for such a long time, waiting for a chance to fight back, but only get to see His Majesty getting stronger. The situation here is complicated. When you seize a city here, most of the nobles will surrender, but without Lady Nightingale, how are you going to make sure they're telling you the truth? Continue. Iron Axe nodded and realized that Beerpaw was not totally mindless. Hey, you've really never thought about this? Beerpaw glared. This Eastern Front army doesn't have many soldiers. We can only station a limited number of them in each city we capture, and they can barely take care of the inner city, but this region used to be Timothy's domain. It'll be alright if the nobles are willing to cooperate with us, but what if they're malicious and still think about seizing back the power? Even if there are only a small number of such people, we'll still have no peace from them. Once we leave a city, they'll make City Hall a puppet or even kill the officials we send here. They've many ways to achieve this, such as poison, assassination, and bribery. These problems can't be prevented by flintlocks. Do you have any suggestions? Iron Axe asked curiously. Boss, that's your business. Beerpaw rolled his eyes and spat out the seeds into the tumbling river. Let's assume that now you're the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front Army. Come on, let's just talk about it hypothetically. Well, Beerpaw thought for a long time and then heaved a long sigh. There's no perfect solution to this problem. If Lady Nightingale can't come to help us, we can only count on time to solve this issue. Or we can hire more rats and take some preventive measures. We can follow the example of Neverwinter and build a police team to preserve the order. Meanwhile, we must use as less local nobles as possible until the end of this war. Sure enough, Iron Axe whispered. What? No, nothing. Iron Axe put the telescope away. Now you can go to inform the people on the other boats to get ready to land. We're near the suburbs wharf. Got it. Beerpaw was thrilled to hear that a battle was coming. "I've been floating on the river for too long. Now, I'll finally get to be in combat here." Seeing his lieutenant leave excitedly, Iron Axe exhaled relaxedly and leaned over the porthole in the command room, lost in thought. He could not help but recall the scene where Edith had had a talk with him before he had left Neverwinter. The place Edith had arranged for this talk had been a private room in Evelyn's tavern, which was not a place for formal discussion. Iron Axe had expected that Edith, an official of the Ministry of Defense, would have congratulated him beforehand on the success of this military action, trying to build a good personal relationship with the army. However, when he had come into the room, he had seen no one else but Pearl of the Northern Region herself and had heard from her something totally beyond his expectation. What they had discussed was exactly the problematic thing mentioned by Beerpaw. Iron Axe still clearly remembered everything Edith had said. Back then, he had been stunned by her first sentence. "Do you know why His Majesty let you command the Eastern Front Army?" "I only obey his orders and never ask for the reason." "But orders don't include all the details for an action, especially those which could not be exposed," Pearl of the Northern Region had said slowly while sipping her chaos drink. "You thought you were chosen because you were the most suitable one. But is it true? You know the guys in the Eastern Region better than me. Any well-trained regular army consisting of 500 or 600 soldiers can defeat them like crushing dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. In other words, any regular battalion commander will be enough to cope with the battle in the Eastern Front. By contrary, the Western Front Army has to fight against the Holy City of Hermes. The combat there will be more complicated and dangerous. If it had not been for something special about you, the king would have asked you to help him in leading the Western Front Army and found someone else to command the Eastern Front Army." Iron Axe had been lost for words at that time but had somehow agreed with Edith in his heart. Edith then had explained further. "As for this special thing about you, it's simple. That's your attitude toward the nobles. As a Majin man, naturally, you won't fear or tolerate the Grey Castle nobles, and dealing with the rebellious nobles is the key to recapture the Eastern region." Just like Beerpaw, she had also analyzed the situation for him. Her analysis was so detailed and convincing that he had to agree that ordinary methods could not stabilize the situation in the Eastern region. His Majesty needs resources of people and materials, and he doesn't have so much time to deal with this bunch of scum. The only problem is, His Majesty didn't give a clear order for it. He had raised this question to Edith and she had replied by saying, "His Majesty is a merciful lord and can't give any clear order for this, so he needs us to take care of this thing for him. Besides, he did hint about it. This time, City Hall will send 265 officials to the Eastern region together with you. His Majesty has spent a lot of money and effort training these officials and plans to send them to manage the region for him. There are more than twice the number of Eastern Front Army soldiers than the officials in this region. You should know the reason for this." Iron Axe remembered that a bolt of lightning had flashed across his mind at that moment. Edith had reminded him in the end. "Don't disappoint His Majesty." Suddenly, a report interrupted his thought. "My lord, the First Army is ready to land. We can come to the dock any time." Iron Axe took a deep breath and ordered in a deep voice, "Let's land and camp. Get ready for battle." Chapter 870, Siege. The sounds of brass trumpets came from afar and broke the silence of the noon. The birds in the courtyard stopped tweeting, which seemed like an omen. At this moment, this hall in the castle looked solemn and dull. Duke Williamberger knew that it was the time for the decisive battle. He moved his eyes from the portrait of the former King Timothy to a set of delicate full armor, which was inherited from his grandfather. He had repeatedly patched and polished it. Each piece of it was soaked with grease which formed something like a skin on its surface. His family's motto engraved on the right armor read "Undying Loyalty." In this set of armor, he had caught the rebellious old duke alive on the battlefield in a rain of arrows. For this brilliant achievement, Timothy had bestowed on him the title of Lord of the Eastern Region. Although Timothy was gone, the duty of a lord would not be interrupted by this incident. He made up his mind to keep his honor. My lord, Prince Roland's army is approaching Valencia. They didn't carry any big firearm with them. A servant walked into the hall and reported to him. Good. Willian nodded. Tell the others to get ready. I'll come over very soon. Yes. He took off his coat and walked to the armor. Help me put on the armor, he said to his chief knight, Galena. Yes. She rolled up her sleeves and started to help him change his clothes. Her hands were rough and calloused but now moved slowly and gently whilst removing his clothes. It was hard to believe that these hands could also hold a spear to penetrate armor and stab her enemies on the battlefield. Whenever he saw her killing whilst in combat, he would be enchanted by that scene. Do you regret it? Of course not, my lord, Galena replied calmly. The moment you decided to make me your chief knight, I made up my mind to stay with you forever. No matter what happens, I'll do my duty. But this time, the enemy is stronger than ever. If it's possible, the Duke was interrupted by the belt suddenly tightening around his waist. So why did you refuse to ally with King of Dawn, if you think that our opponent is that strong? You even openly kicked his messenger out of Valencia. When the envoy sent this information back to Dawn, the king must have blamed you for being unable to appreciate a favor. Tut, I highly doubt whether the city of Glow is able to resist the attack of Prince Roland's troops, and Appen Moya really crossed the line to ask me to provide him harbors and permanent military bases. Willian curled his lips in contempt. Is there any difference between him and Roland Wimbledon? The former king granted me the eastern region. If I had promised Appen, I would have failed my king. So my answer is still the same, Galena said without any hesitation. The Burger family is not alone in rating loyalty as the top quality, so my lord, please don't say that anymore. It's an insult to me. Willian fell silent. A moment later, he said, unfortunately, most nobles have forgotten this point. I see, let's go to war together. Although the enemy is powerful, I won't let them seize Valencia easily. I've been waiting for this battle for a long time. Yes, my lord. The female knight smiled. Bale. He shouted out his clerk's name. Come here. Soon, a bald middle-aged man came into the hall. My lord, what can I do for you? Write down what I say. After a whole night's rest, the Kingslayer Roland Wimbledon's minions planned to officially launch an attack at Valencia today. Duke of Valencia, Willian Burger, determines to defeat them in the name of the former king, and his brave, loyal chief knight, Galena Wynn decides to go with him to the battle with resolution. May the deities bless them. Willie paused. Surely, if you think this record seems too subjective, you can omit the last sentence. Bale nodded while rapidly noting down what the Duke said on his notebook with a charcoal pen. I think that it'll be all right if I write down the last sentence, my lord. There's no absolutely objective record in this world. Since I'm clerk of Valencia, it'll be totally acceptable if my favor goes to this city. This is also a part of the reality. So keep it there, but no matter what happens next, you have to faithfully record the outcome of the war, understand? Willie emphasized. It's your mission to record the reason and the whole process of this war. Please be assured, my lord. The clerk bowed. I'll let the people remember this event. Without a word, Willian picked up his steel sword hanging on the wall and went out of his castle without looking back. When the Duke and his chief knight climbed up to the lookout tower on top of the city wall, the bonfire had already been lit up. Oil was boiling in the pot and emitted a pungent smell. The Duke's soldiers were busy going up and down, mounting stones and logs on the city wall. He had known from the war in the King's City that Roland's most powerful firearm in a siege battle was a snow powder weapon called cannon, which could shoot much farther than a mangonel. Unfortunately, Timothy had been unable to produce a similar weapon to compete with it to the day when the city had fallen. But on that day, the former king had managed to send his right-hand man to give the Duke the formula for making snow powder and the design and manufacturing process of the weapon. Timothy's purpose was self-evident. Willian had invested a lot in this new weapon and meanwhile had also found many weak points in this kind of firearms. First, it was very heavy and needed to be placed on a flat ground to give full play to its strength. Second, it was slow to set up and thus this assembling process needed to be covered by flintlocks. In general, it was more a defensive weapon than an offensive one. He had done everything in his power to get well prepared for this war. He had thickened the city wall and installed barbs on it. He had also sent his men to destruct all the roads in the suburb and make all the farmland marshland by flooding them with water from the river. He had erected many hidden stumps in the San Juan River, making it hard for any big inland river ship to travel in this waterway. These measures he had adapted had totally changed this place in the past 2 years. Now, it was inconvenient to carry any heavy thing into the city using manpower, let alone carriages drawn by horses. These war preparations cost him dearly. Without convenient connections to the other places, this city of trade could not be prosperous anymore. The destruction of the farmland had led to a sharp reduction in the population. However, the Duke firmly believed his measures were correct, as now he could not find any cannon in the approaching enemy troops. They must have realized that they could never drag their cannons here if they did not build a road first. Next, it was time for a tough battle. Though Roland's soldiers were equipped with highly efficient flintlocks, they could not hide themselves at the foot of the wall or climb up this wall with barbs on the surface. Furthermore, the Duke had set 4 mangonels and 2 cannons in the city, which could hit target 1,000 steps away. Now it was difficult to tell who was winning. "They're coming," Galena warned. A group of soldiers dressed in brown stepped out of the enemy troops, steadily heading toward the gate of the city. They did not move very fast, but their steps were exceptionally firm. Soon they seemed to be unable to stay in formation on the muddy ground and then split into groups of 2 or 3, starting to work in the fields like old farmers. They carried on their backs dark gray long spears and barrels as thick as thighs. The Duke thought that something so light was obviously not a kind of cannon. Will.i.am estimated the distance, raised a red flag and waved it to the soldiers behind him. Huge rock cannon, fire. Chapter 871, An Extraordinary Cannon. A thick tendril of dark gray smoke rose from either side of the city wall, accompanied by 2 huge booms that shook the entire floor of the lookout tower. After the loud noise subsided, a gale of cheer came from the bottom of the wall. Apparently, their first strike significantly boosted their soldiers' spirits. But Will.i.am knew that was all that the first round of firing could make. Judging from the locations of mud splash in the field moments later, he knew he had missed the target. Neither of them had hit the enemies, but they actually landed pretty far away from the default landing spot set in the previous exercise. The shell bounced up after its landing and rolled over for a few meters, leaving a 10-meter shallow groove in the muddy battlefield. As it was a breezy day today, he had to have a few trial shots before he could accurately hit the target with the huge rock cannon. Will.i.am knew very well that the culverin in Roland's army was way better than Valencia's cannon, although the latter cost a ton. The gap between them was even more unbridgeable than that between the flintlocks. The biggest defect of the huge rock cannon was its non-portability. The cannon barrel had cost all the bronze wares they could find in the city, and they even melted the ancient bell on the bell tower to prevent the cannon from exploding. After numerous experiments and tests, they forged a cannon with a barrel wall as thick as a man's arm, so heavy that no wagon could support its overwhelming weight. They had no choice but to build a specific turret to place the cannon. A strong rope was used to control and adjust its firing angle and direction, and it took them at least 15 minutes to load the weapon. What was worse was that the spherical shell made of granite did not create as much damage as Roland's cannon had done when he had attacked the king's city. Will.i.am had tried shells filled with snow powder, but their performance fluctuated. As the outer part of the shell was made of iron, the production rate was low as well. He wondered where Roland found so many materials. So the Duke had decided, from the beginning, to do their best to prevent his enemies using cannons. He believed that as long as they forced the enemies to approach the city, his cannon would eventually manage to hit them. Roland's army halted after their first firing, appearing to be shocked by William's expected attack. They started to retreat until they were about 100 paces away from the shell's landing spot. "What are they doing?" Galena asked, puzzled. Will.i.am raised the telescope, through which he saw the enemies, about 100 men, who had taken their equipment off their backs and started to dig in the ground. It seemed they intended to create an empty space in the field. "I guess they must be afraid and plan to reorganize the troops to have a prolonged battle." A viscount who watched the battle at the lookout tower with them said, "It's rumored that Roland Wimbledon abandoned all the knights and has formed an army of uncivilized farmers. He did not suffer any setbacks in the previous wars because of his fine firearms. But now he must be very hesitant to launch an attack at our defensive line. You turned soil into mud. What a nice move, my lord. But our incomes have reduced drastically, and we lost many squires as well," another man said, frowning. "Many people fled in the months of demons of this year, abandoning half the workshops in the city. I suggest it'd be better to negotiate a truce with Roland Wimbledon. We have to win an equal position before jumping into a negotiation. Let's just win another battle first." "Shut up, all of you," Will.i.am said agitatedly. "I'll never bend to the Kingslayer. If you would like to sacrifice your noble titles and betray King Timothy, I'll lock you up with the nasty mob in the cellar first." That silenced everyone instantly. Such a great price had Valencia paid to prepare for this battle. The former trade center had not only converted to a stronghold, but Duke Will.i.am had also bent his rules as well. However, in his opinion, all the sacrifices would pay off. If Prince Roland had decided to form an alliance with nobles to rule Grey Castle in the first place, he would have been defeated long before. In fact, the prince intended to overthrow the entire feudal system and have full control over the kingdom, a monstrous decision that would outrage the whole high class. This bold move actually gave him a perfect reason to resist. If he could thwart Roland's army this time, the other nobles would change their minds and support him in keeping in charge of the eastern region. Meanwhile, more protesters would emerge in Grey Castle. He would say that it was not only a battle for King Timothy but also a defense for the feudal system. "Huge rock cannons are loaded, my lord," a servant reported. "Are we going to keep firing?" Galena asked. "No, hang on, it was hard for our cannon to hit the enemies now unless we add snow powder." William shook his head. Now he regretted his proactive strategy a little. He had thought that an early firing would help to finish the adjustment earlier, but he did not expect the enemy to halt after seeing their first firing. Now the sight of the enemies busy in mud gave him a disturbing feeling. The 100 men, dividing into a dozen teams, shoveled and created an empty space that could merely accommodate 2 people. It was unlikely that it was prepared for camping. After the cleaning, they started to fiddle with those green long barrels. Through the telescope, Will.i.am could spy the enemy's every movement. It seemed that the long barrel was only a component supported by a tripod beneath it and was padded with a concave iron plate at the bottom. Other than that, a few sticks were strangely attached to the barrel. All the parts were separately carried by a different person, but it only took those men less than 15 minutes to assemble all of the components. How ingenious the design was! However, the Duke almost could not believe his eyes as he saw what happened next. A spindle-shaped can was put into the barrel before a puff of white smoke ejected out of the mouth of the barrel. As the nobles were wondering what that thing was, all of a sudden, a dozen dark red fireballs blasted on either side of the city wall, followed by a series of thunderous booms. As the houses close to the inner side of the city wall had been replaced with all kinds of traps and obstacles, the explosions did not cause much damage, but the mighty scene gave Will.i.am an ineffable shock. At that moment, there was only one voice left in his mind. "That is a cannon? Really? How can it be?" The Duke had not witnessed Roland's cannon troop, but he had heard so much of it. The cannons they equipped could categorized into 2 types based on their lengths, one portable type that could be placed on a wagon, and the other must be transported by boat. Neither was, however, light enough to be carried by ordinary men. It took all the craftsmen and materials in Valencia, and 2 years to forge the 2 cannons that barely worked. Will.i.am admitted that it all attributed to the lack of techniques and experience, but he believed that the principle they had applied was no different from Roland's. He was confident that with a few more years, his craftsmen would surely be able to make similar weapons. But what happened in front of him totally blew his mind. How could such barrels with such thin tubes bear the enormous pressure generated by the explosion of snow powder? It doesn't make any sense. Replace the rock shell with half a bag of snow powder. Duke turned around and growled to his servant. Fire right after you finish loading. 10 gold royals for one man you shoot down. The servant was a little uncertain. Half a bag? My lord, that may destroy the cannon. If we let them strike our wall without any defense, the huge rock cannon will be useless. Will.i.am grabbed the servant's collar and said, "Do as I say. Now." That was when another cloud of white smoke rose from where the enemies were stationed. How could they fire again within no more than 30 seconds? This time, Will.i.am heard a soft buzzing, like birds singing or the whistling sound when arrows pierced the air. Phew! The next moment, several blazing fireballs soared on the top of the wall. Scalding heat waves spread and knocked down the bonfires and the oil basin. Within a blink, the wall was ablaze. Chapter 872, The Last Charge. In the end, these huge rock cannons never managed to fire for the second time. The Duke had built these 6 tall firing platforms within the city walls to provide a clear view for the cannons and the mangonels. As long as the platforms were higher than the walls, no enemies will be able to escape the weapon's firing range. It should have been a sound strategy, for such a commanding view would not only improve the accuracy and the range of projectiles, but it would also provide overwhelming pressure to the besiegers. But faced with the might of Roland's army, these imposing platforms served no other purpose other than being live target practice for the opposing army's cannons. These 15 minutes felt like an eternity for Will.i.am. The thunderous sounds of explosions never ceased on top of the wall. Just as William's men finally managed to load the snow powder, a cannonball from the enemy landed on the platform right next to them. At that moment, it was as if a radiant sun emerged on the platform, growing in size as it engulfed the huge rock cannon as well as over the 20 unfortunate men who were by its side. The blazing flame then spread out in all directions, and the shockwave swept throughout the city. Dust clouds rose up and blew everywhere. A large chunk of bronze was blown away by the explosion and crashed onto the stone wall of another platform before falling directly on top of a group of workers who were transporting rocks. The weak and fragile human bodies were instantly pulverized into a cloud of red mist. The bronze chunk rolled twice after it hit the ground, running over those who were lucky enough to survive the initial crash, leaving a thick trail of flesh and blood behind. The victims who only had their limbs scrunched still lingered on with their last breath of life, letting out agonizing cries, hoping for the mercy of a quicker death. However, William's attention quickly moved away from the tragic scene below. The lookout tower upon which Will.i.am and the nobles were standing on equally stood out in the enemy's line of sight, and since the enemy's first barrage turned the city wall ablaze, those nobles no longer dared to watch on and immediately evacuated. This was obviously the best move, as the enemy's rate of fire was far beyond their expectations. It took the enemy no more than 30 seconds to reload, and each shot was more accurate than the last, turning the areas near the city wall into no man's land. At first, the fireballs were only impacted the outside of the city, but soon they started to go off within the walls. The explosions engulfed the tall platforms and the city gate. The air inside the city was dense with smoke, cannonball fragments, and dirt, while the constant blasts combined with sounds of wailing made the situation in the city resemble a scene from hell. By the time the enemy stopped firing, the 6 platforms had been completely destroyed, and the city gate was breached. The Duke's men should have, as had been planned, immediately put down the iron barriers or lowered the heavy stone gates to block the passage and prepared to hold the line. But after witnessing such horrifying firepower, it was impossible to continue to have them stand their ground. The flames spread everywhere as it followed the oily liquid, and charred bodies began to litter the city wall. Even if someone had managed to survive the downpour of fire and explosions, their courage would have already been thoroughly crushed. As for the civilians who were hastily drafted, they were simply out of the question. Those who were still capable of escaping were long gone, abandoning the rest who were either frightened out of their wits or severely wounded. Although Will.i.am had thought of the possibility of defeat, he did not expect it to happen so quickly. Their defense line crumbled before they even had a chance to touch the enemy. What has Roland been doing in the past 2 years? He could not help but wonder. My lord, there's no way for us to fight back. We'd better surrender. Indeed, my lord. Surrendering does not mean we are giving up forever. There will always be other opportunities as long as we stay alive. He's right. We could bide our time and rebuild our forces as long as they stay in the eastern region. Even King Timothy wouldn't blame you if he was here. You've done your best, and the enemy was just too overwhelming. Will.i.am remained silent for a moment, before turning to look at Galena. The woman's face was streaked with 2 black marks, and part of her hair had been burned by the flame when she had tried to block a burning beam that crashed down to protect Will.i.am during their evacuation. Even so, her eyes shone with the same kind of brightness that she has always had, without the slightest trace of frustration or embarrassment. I'm at your command, my lord, she said. The Duke took a deep breath before saying, you all should surrender. My lord. What about you? I did not prepare for these 2 years just so that I can surrender in the end, Will.i.am said slowly. I will have Roland understand that his almighty army cannot conquer everything, and I need to show him that King Timothy's feudatories are not all cowards who would bow beneath a tyrant. Galena, where are my knights? They're all standing by in the second ambush area, Chief Knight said decisively. There's no need for an ambush. Summon them to the city gate. Will.i.am gave the command. Discount Audiobook, disable all the previously placed traps. Disable them? But why? The nobles asked in surprise. Those simple tricks aren't going to help us hold back the enemy. We might as well let them in and confront them fair and square. Things have already come this far, and someone has to face the consequences. The Duke had not expected himself to be so calm in his final moments. However, what he was going to do would be recorded down in the annals of history, and he would then be able to face His Majesty with pride. Half an hour later, Roland's army finally showed outside at the city gate. A small team was first sent in to remove the debris blocking the entrance and also to take control of both sides of the city gate before the main force marched into the castle. As soon as they entered the city, they started to set up a rough perimeter in the middle of the long street. Within a short amount of time, they finished their work and placed 2 peculiar flintlocks in front of the fortress. Will.i.am no longer cared about what the enemy was doing. He softly flicked the reins and led the knights around the corner of the street and formed a single line across the street. 7 knights and 15 squires, his last counterattack. At this final moment, these warriors who dared to stand alongside him further convinced Will.i.am that the system of nobility was essential and superior. Only the nobles who understand the meaning of loyalty, honor, and duty were brave enough to charge towards the enemy under such unfavorable odds. Seeing more and more invaders gathering and preparing on the street, he pulled down the visor on his helm, held up his spear, and let out a long breath. We may have lost the battle today, but history will remember us. For our names will be recorded in verses and sang in songs. Muster your courage, stand strong, and fight until your last dying breath. Knights of House Burger, on me. To victory! Will.i.am flicked the reins and sent his destrier into a gallop and sped up in the long street, leading his men in this final charge. Clouds of smoke and the lingering flames around them had perfectly painted the battlefield, forming a scene so serene that for a moment the Duke thought that he could ask for no better place than here to finally rest. Soon he was halfway to the enemy, and he reached his top speed, but he did not hear the drum-like patter of the hooves that was supposed to come from behind him. As he looked back, Will.i.am was shocked. The over 20 men that started the charge with him were now gone with the exception of Galena, who rode close after him. This street was not closed but intersected with many smaller roads and alleys. In that moment, Will.i.am understood what had happened. What happened? He wanted to ask the knight who was charging fearlessly behind him, but when his eyes landed on Galena's eyes that were filled with meaning and emotion, it seemed as if nothing else mattered to him now. An end like this seemed not too bad for him. At least I have you by my side. Will.i.am laughed and pointed his spear towards the nearest enemy soldier. Before a hailstorm of bullets rained upon him. Chapter 873, Nobles and Prisoners. As Iron Axe entered the once proud city of Valencia, he was surprised by the devastation that the new weapon had wrought, but he did not let this emotion show on his face. Even though he had participated in many drills with the mortar, witnessing these weapons in a live battle was a completely different experience. It was unfathomable how this mobile device that can be easily carried by a group of 5 people could cause such havoc even with just a limited number of rounds. He knew that the mortar's rate of fire was much faster than the previous field artillery, and he knew that they can cause large-scale destruction if dozens of them were to fire at once. But it seemed that he had much underestimated this new weapon now that he witnessed it in action. Even though a single shot of the mortar cannot compare to that of a long-song cannon in sheer firepower, the mortar was easier to control, more mobile, and could be transported without the witch's help. Furthermore, its shooting trajectory allows it to attack enemies who are hiding behind walls. With sufficient ammunition, the weapon could give the enemy a barrage so devastating that even the highly disciplined First Army might not be able to withstand if they were the ones on the receiving end instead. No, it is only normal to flee under this circumstance. Who wouldn't piss themselves if a rain of fire were to descend upon them? Iron Axe finally understood the confidence His Majesty had shown when he threw all those seemingly sophisticated field artillery back into the furnace area. To be honest, those weapons that shot out solid rounds at the enemy seemed useless compared to the mortar. Well, in the end, probably only King Roland could afford such a firearm in the entire Grey Castle. It was said that each shell cost around 3 to 4 gold royals, so what the First Army used earlier by bombarding the city with hundreds of shells was as good as throwing away solid gold. Moreover, the shrapnel used by the long-song cannons were far more expensive. By the time they confronted demons, will the gold royals in the Neverwinter's coffer be enough to sustain the First Army until the end of the Battle of Divine Will? Fortunately, he did not need to worry about this problem. That hard nut was for Berev to crack. As for the army, their only obligation was to obtain victory for His Majesty. Iron Axe and his men passed through the long street that was filled with the smoke of gunpowder. They soon arrived at the center of the city square, where the First Army had rounded up all the surrendered nobles. Iron Axe's eyes moved over the captives whose appearances were in complete shambles. Before he could say anything, a nobleman stood out and said, "I'm Shipbay Lord, Earl Cassin. May I ask where King Roland is?" Valencia was built on a piece of land that was surrounded by water, and many nobles had named their lands with bays and beaches. Iron Axe dimly remembered that Shipbay was a large piece of land sandwiched by Valencia and Seawanshire. A family that held such a superior place should have been admired and awed by his subjects. However, at this moment, the nobleman's raised chin and pretentious manner looked ridiculous to Iron Axe. His Majesty is too busy to handle the business in the East region. He entrusted me with full responsibility over this front, he answered. You? Earl Cassin frowned. Is he joking? He is obviously not a person from Grey Castle. Roland Wimbledon would let a man from the Sand Nation manage his army? How could he not personally lead his army on an expedition as large as this? Was he not afraid that his men would scatter and flee? Shipbay Lord was not the only one in doubt. The other nobles were also questioning the new king's decision. His Excellency Iron Axe is without a doubt the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front Army. We can all testify, Lieutenant Beerpaw could not help but cry out. Eastern Front Army? What's that? Cassin asked. It is the army sent to recover the eastern region, of course. Beerpaw. Iron Axe interrupted sharply. The lieutenant, suddenly aware of his mistake, hastily covered his mouth with one hand. Lady Edith was right. Even though His Majesty was hell-bent on having the nobles relinquish all their feudal power and abolishing nobility once and for all, those nobles still had an influence on the people. Beerpaw, who used to be a hunter, might not look servile in front of the group of nobles, but he was obviously affected by these nobles' titles, or he would never have made such a basic mistake. It seems only Iron Axe can maintain indifference in front of these highborn. Iron Axe then said in a low voice, "Believe it or not, the truth won't change. Why are you the one asking the questions? Where is the Duke of Valencia? Isn't he the person in charge of the eastern region?" The Duke has sacrificed himself in the battle. Cassin shook his head with a look of grief. He insisted on leading the knights in a head-on charge. We couldn't stop him. So the rider who was riddled with bullets was the Duke. Iron Axe raised his eyebrow. He's definitely qualified to be called a warrior. He looked at the nobles who was still armored and asked, but my men only reported 2 defenders. Where's the so-called knightage? How could it be that there's only 1 knight serving the warden of the eastern region? Well, Cassin was speechless for a moment. Stop concerning yourself over those irrelevancies. Now that we know you're the head of the army, we will just tell you our request. Another nobleman stood out and said, we would surrender and serve Roland Wimbledon only if he meets us personally, or if His Majesty is too busy to be here, we could also send messengers to him. And you are? I'm Viscount Ari Burke, he said impatiently. Till then, we hope to be treated properly. If it's a ransom you want, simply say the amount. But what you've done is treason, Iron Axe said, emotionless. Even your titles won't spare you from a trial. First of all, Duke Williamberger was the one who committed treason, and he has already paid for it. We didn't ask to be here, and according to the law, our crimes should be less severe. Exactly, we're not his feudatory, but we're just under his jurisdiction. Cassin seemed to have come to and echoed, secondly, His Majesty should be the one giving us the final verdict. Don't tell me you are planning to sentence us yourself? It did not take long before Iron Axe realized why those defeated nobles still put on airs. When they noticed that Roland Wimbledon was not here himself, they became less interested in negotiating. It was common practice for the punishment of the defeated to be given out by the king. In their opinion, the so-called sentence was less of a punishment but more of a business transaction. In general, those who failed to pay up would be eliminated, and those who could pay would be able to get off relatively scot-free. It was probably not their first time facing a defeat, so these nobles were confident that they could offer up something of interest to the king as ransom. Unfortunately, the King Iron Axe served as no ordinary noble. Iron Axe shrugged before saying, You're right. I don't have the authority. But be as it may, you are still traitors who have committed treason. Before His Majesty reaches a decision, I will have to detain you until my king has summoned you. How long will it take? Shipbay Earl said unpleasantly. And just as we said before, we haven't done anything that could be called betrayal in the eyes of the law unless you can show us some concrete proof. At most a month considering the speed of carrier pigeon. Iron Axe gave a rare laugh, ignoring the Earl's second half of the sentence. Rest assured, the food and clothing will all be up to the standards that you deserve. Late at night 2 days later, Beerpaw, panic-stricken, dashed into Iron Axe's tent. Something happened, my lord. The castle's dungeon is on fire. Chapter 874, Men of Sin. Despite the fact that there were numerous functioning wells around the castle, the servants were still unable to control the flames. The fire started without any notice, and by the time people outside realized that something was wrong, thick columns of smoke already filled the whole interior of the dungeon and held back any potential rescue attempts. The First Army promptly retreated out of the castle and sealed off the area. The fire lasted for hours, and by the time most of the smoke had finally dissipated, there was already nothing left of the prisoners previously held inside. Without delay, the First Army started to clean up the scene and investigate the incident. The officers who came with the army set up a temporary city hall and began to take over the administration of Valencia. Soon they found out the cause of the fire. A group of rats had sneaked into the dungeon through a secret passage and ignited the stacks of wheat on account of their resentment for Duke Burger, who turned this once prosperous trade city into a husk of its former self. Therefore, this was an egregious arson, a significant threat to the order of the eastern region, and an act of open defiance to the First Army of Neverwinter. Apart from propagandizing the investigation result, the First Army and the City Hall started a citywide operation to root out the rats. Leniency to those who confessed, punishment to those who resisted, silvers for those who reported, grains for anyone with information. Moreover, the food liberated from the mansions of the nobles was recirculated back into the market and was also used to succor the starving. The previously near-dead city now regained its vitality. The night the command to exterminate the rats was given, Bearpaw entered Iron Axe's tent once again. "Chief, we've spotted some signs of the evacuation of the big families." A dozen carriages exited through the West City gate, seemingly heading for Seawindshire. Some of the furrows left behind by the carriages were particularly deep, so I think they must be loaded with gold and jewelry. Iron Axe put down the quill in his hand. "I've made myself clear at the start that I will only want their food, so they can take anything else as they wish." The commander-in-chief was not at all surprised when he heard about the nobles' hasty evacuation. The moment the dungeon was on fire, any trust between the First Army and the nobles had crumbled. At that point, fleeing this place was, in their opinions, the only way to survive. A noble family could bear losing its lords and some knights, for the title could be inherited, and more knights can be accoladed, but they have already lost the courage to confront the First Army directly. Instead of staying here to wait for their inevitable demise, they had much rather take the remaining family members, servants, and fortune to somewhere far away in hopes of new opportunities. Their lands were very important, but naturally, they much more cherished their lives. Also, to prepare for battle, William Burger had gathered all the nearby resources to Valencia, thus leaving the surrounding lands in such a sorry state that it would take at least 2 or 3 years of hard work before they were of any value again. Otherwise, those nobles would not have made up their mind to turn tail and run away so soon. "Chief, I have one more question." Bearpaw paused, his next words frozen on his lips. This was very rare for the simple-minded lieutenant. "Go on," Iron Axe said seriously. "Were you the one who set the dungeon on fire?" Bearpaw hesitated for a long moment before he asked this under his breath. "What makes you say that?" The secret tunnel was designed with a partition door made of solid iron that was far beyond a few rats' skills to open. Also, I don't think our station brothers were so lax that they would be completely unaware of the arsonists. I've checked the dungeon, and the burning marks suggested that the fire was more likely to have started in the corridor rather than in the cells. Lastly, from the look of the burnt wreckage, I believe the blaze was fueled by oil." "You're right. The fire was set under my command." Iron Axe nodded. Bearpaw, who was startled by his boss's unreserved confession, was stunned for a while before he found his voice again. "Why? I think it's better that these kinds of things are left for me to handle. The more people that know of the plan means a bigger chance for something to go wrong." "That's not what I mean." The lieutenant shook his head. "I mean, didn't they already surrender?" "I see." Iron Axe meditated for a moment and said, "To be frank, I don't have the time to discern whether or not they were sincere in their surrender, nor does His Majesty has time to judge one by one. This is why His Majesty had given me full control over the Eastern Front before the army left Neverwinter." "But are you going to tell me that a sentence without a trial may kill the innocents among them?" Iron Axe said brusquely, handing his lieutenant a book on the desk. "Have a look. Is this a demographic report?" "Yes, we found it in the library." The chief nodded. 5 years ago, 220,000 people were living in Valencia and the surrounding lands. It was the most prosperous area in the eastern region. But by this year, the population has dropped to a mere 60,000. The refugees we've taken in from the eastern region are about 30,000 to 40,000 people in total. If we round it up to 40,000, the deficit still stands at about around 120,000 even without considering the growth in population. I believe you are aware of the cause for this." Bearpaw gasped. "The farmlands that were ruined by floods. And they have also distorted Valencia beyond recognition." Iron Axe arose and walked up to the candlestick, his hands on his back. William apparently called up all the people who lived nearby to work for him. They were sent to block the roads and reinforce the walls. He alone should never have been entitled to this kind of authority. This would never have been possible unless he was backed by someone more powerful or, even worse, assisted by the other nobles. As a result, the massive dislocation of people had severely interrupted trade and left much of the crops unattended to. In other words, all those nobles are accomplices of the Duke. Now, do you still believe that His Majesty will accept their allegiance?" Beerpaw was dumbfounded for a moment. But they did not lie about believing in their innocence, Iron Axe continued. For all they care, what they've done was no big deal. Even with half of the farmlands ending up being devastated, their mansions were still crammed with food, and even human. After all, meat can save for longer than wheat when properly stored. Beerpaw's pupils suddenly contracted. To put the cherry on top, what they've done critically hinders the progress of His Majesty's plan. Our king values the population more than any other resource, but they squandered their human resources wastefully. Can you imagine how the battle would have turned out if we didn't have the mortars with us? You know how difficult it is to move the field artillery in the mud. We would have had to resort to storming the city or prolonging the battle. I don't think the nobles would have yielded before they used up all their people had we not have come prepared. Iron Axe turned around. Any other questions? For a long moment, Beerpaw kept his head down. Finally, he glanced up. You're right. It would be too merciful to let them just burn to death. But His Majesty didn't give this specific command, did he? What if he hears of? What do you mean what if? Iron Axe raised his eyebrow. Do you think that I'll hide this from my king? No, he'll know. I've included everything that has happened in Valencia so far in the report for him, and I'll take full responsibility regardless of the outcome. Chapter 875, Objective History. The chaos that he had expected in Valencia did not come in the end, and the situation completely exceeded Bale's imagination. Having worked as a clerk for several lords, he naturally knew what the breaching of the walls meant: plunder, massacre, disorder, exile. Whether the intruders were knights, mobs, or pirates, it did not make much of a difference. That was the case with His Majesty, Timothy, and also with the ascension of the new duke. The city's food and wealth were the best rewards for intruders. This had always been the norm, just like nobles who were born to be superior to the common people. This was recorded in the history books numerous times, proving its credibility. However, this time the situation was completely different. Roland's army not only spared the city people's lives, but also tried to comfort and calm them. The piles of wheat that were found in the Duke's castle were cooked into oatmeal and distributed to the hungry people. A large number of job offers were posted in the main square, which stated that the participants could not only get food but also salary. Didn't Roland's soldiers mind giving out what originally belonged to them to a bunch of people they did not know? Did Prince Roland come all this way to conquer Valencia only to squander his own treasury? Within the records of all kinds of books, Bale had never seen such a behavior before. Still, all this just made him a bit surprised. But there was something else that actually made the clerk feel a deep fear. And that was the castle fire several days ago. The rumor that the fire was set by the rats had many loopholes. Bale had served 3 dukes and lived in the castle for more than 20 years, yet he had never found the entrance of any secret path. When it came down to life or death situations, the design would have been very secretive and safe. This way, even people on the inside would not be able to discover it, not to mention those from the outside. If those rats actually had the ability to discover something like that, they would have never degraded to Blackstreet rats in the first place. That fire must have been set by Roland's people. Once he realized that, Bale felt a sudden grip on his heart. For the first time, nobles were no longer more important than common people. Their lives had the same value as those who lived within the city walls, without any insurance anymore. Maybe in even more danger. As for the big families that had also realized that and had not yet been apprehended by Roland, they swiftly reacted and escaped Valencia. They probably even left the kingdom of Grey Castle. So, what would happen next? Would something like that also happen to him? In the past few days, the clerk had lost a bunch of hair and the bald spot on his head had grown bigger. His fear was not without reason because, in the past 10 years, he had been called a noble without a title, or more accurately, the closest a civilian can be to a noble. He had served several lords, had plenty of experience, knowledge, and had read many more books than normal people. It was exactly because of that, whether it was Garcia's sacking or Eastern Region's change in power, he had safely survived both. Even if the people in the city were killed like the straw being cut in the field, he still observed and vigorously recorded those events. But now, he was too afraid to even fall asleep. Even though the formidable army had not acted against any non-noble so far or even against those common people who had worked for the big families, he still was not certain whether they would not do anything in the future. He could not ask those families to take him with them since he was a common man after all, but he also did not want to just stay and wait around. He felt he had to do something. Under the swaying candle, the clerk's gaze turned to the unfinished history book about Valencia. Thinking about all the stuff he wrote, Bale couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. That's right, I almost forgot that. He quickly turned to the last page, tore it into pieces, and burned them until each and every one of them had become ash. No, this is probably not enough. Bale thought for a moment, then took out a quill and prepared to write. No matter the consequences, you must record the truth. Do you understand? Duke William's words sounded echoed throughout his mind. Of course, he would record the truth, even now. This was a clerk's duty. But in this world, nothing was absolutely objective. He was now living in a city governed by Roland. So, being a little bit biased was not strange. In other words, this was also part of being objective. Bale took a deep breath and started writing. The ambassador sent by the great King Roland Wimbledon arrived in his loyal city of Valencia today. Outside of the city of Redwater, at the camp of the First Army. Your Highness, there is a secret letter from Eastern region. Nightingale jumped out of the mist while holding a grey goshawk in her hands. The latter tugged its claws towards Roland and grunted with dissatisfaction as if complaining about the letter being too heavy. There were 6 notes tied on its paws, almost covering both of its feet. Only when Nightingale handed out a bunch of grilled fishes, did the carrier pigeon finally calm down. Well, this could not be considered a secret letter anymore. Roland opened the 6 densely written notes one by one and had a quick look at them. They were sent by Iron Axe and they were mainly focused on the post-war summary and the situation reports. The first part was exactly the same as he had expected. The Eastern Front Army had easily occupied Valencia. During the battle, the mortar's effect was significant. Faced with the firepower of the 12-pound field artillery, even though it was a siege, the enemy still had no chance to fight back. But when he read the last part, Roland was a bit surprised. What happened? Did something happen there? Nightingale asked. Well, not really a problem, it's just a bit strange. He passed the 5th note to her. Look here. Burning the dungeon where the nobles were imprisoned? Nightingale immediately found the key point after a glance. This wasn't your order? Roland shook his head. No, I told him that he has full authority at the Battle of the Eastern Front. So, what's strange then? She asked confusedly. Since he has full authority, any measure he takes should be acceptable, right? Not to mention that those people had ulterior motives anyway. They still haven't surrendered to you after so long, so apart from sweeping them up, we could also use this chance to clear the rats. Seems like a double win. You're right, Roland said while stroking his chin with his hand. Deep in his heart, he still felt this approach was too soft. The Eastern region was the second prince's home for a long time. Seizing the city was only the first step. The following political battle with the surrendered nobles would be a key point in achieving full control of the city. It's for this reason that he had arranged over half of the novice officials trained in the city hall to go to the east and had appointed Iron Axe, who was from the Sand Nation, to be the commander of the Eastern Front Army and deal with the complex intricacies of the relationships with the nobility. He believed that after occupying Valencia, in order to eliminate the enemies, Iron Axe would almost certainly use his interrogation techniques to the fullest. When it came to the Majin's torture, even the high priests of the church were not able to resist, not to mention those weak nobles. Through bloody trials and executions, he would destroy their power step by step and establish a new order. However, setting a fire directly was not Iron Axe's style at all. Roland thought for a while and decided to leave this matter alone for now. Once the two armies met, he would find out more about it. After all, just like Nightingale said, the result of this fire was far too good. It made the nobles fear for their lives, leaving the territory en masse without caring about their lands anymore. At this speed, Sewanshire and the rest of the domain would be under the complete control of the city hall within a month. At first, he had thought that the Eastern Front situation would last for a while, but, unexpectedly, it had even surpassed the Western Front's progress. Chapter 876, Silver City. Roland shrugged. It seemed that he had to work harder. Being overtaken by his own subordinates was never something to be proud of. Thankfully, Redwater City was now back to normal. Out of the remaining filtered nobles, 70% had decided to continue doing their previous jobs while the rest wanted to try their luck at the city hall, even though the basic requirement to apply for the administration exam, literacy of sentences, was easy for them. Roland still believed that after the final tests, these people would not have too much of a chance to become official members. After all, it was hard for nobles to change their habits. But certainly, becoming a normal clerk was much better than losing your head. There were even 3 nobles who wanted to join the First Army. They were knights originally, and when being observed by Nightingale, they did not conceal any evil thoughts. However, he still stood by his original decision and refused their applications. Having solved the issue of the feudal power, the work efficiency of Redwater City and the surrounding areas had greatly improved. In just over a week, more than 20,000 people had boarded the ships for Neverwinter, whilst more and more people continued to arrive at Redwater. At first glance, abandoning the small towns and villages seemed to decrease the amount of land they could control, but in fact, it drastically increased his capability to control the city hall. In such an age where even roads were scarce, the implementation of government decrees in the countryside was something he could only dream of. Arranging a few leaders within the course of a year was rather doable, but asking them to go around implementing the decrees was quite difficult. Berev had asked him more than once why he persisted in sending people to Neverwinter, instead of unifying the kingdom and leaving everything as it was. He had never fully answered him. It was because the city hall director could not imagine how many people could actually be absorbed by the compounded industry of coal and iron, nor understand how much energy and time it actually took to build such an industry. And the most important part was that those remote territories could not operate effectively, and thus, from the perspective of resource utilization, keeping them would just be a waste. Thus, it was more suitable for the current situation of Grey Castle to gather the population in several major cities with convenient transportation. It was from that moment of land reform that Roland finally acquired jurisdiction of the Redwater area. As for his next target, that was Silver City. Compared to the huge city of Redwater, the old King City district was much easier to deal with. It was originally a common city, not much different from the several cities encircling the King's City. However, its existence became more special when the first silver mine was discovered there. As more and more precious mineral veins were being excavated, the city became busier and busier, and eventually reached its current size. Considering the great importance of Silver City's output to Greycastle's economy, the latest lords were only appointed by the family of Earl William, the good old man who was loyal to the Wimbledons. In addition, their power was also restricted, and in the next couple of years, the city was almost never allocated to other nobles. In other words, as long as the lord of the city declared it, Silver City would always be a thing. Roland believed that persuading the other side was not a difficult task, considering he was the descendant of King Wimbledon III and the most suitable heir to the throne. However, he was somewhat concerned about the fact that the city, which was built on mineral veins, was Nightingale's hometown. Every time he asked her about it, he would get the same answer: "I have cut my ties with the Guyland family, so you don't have to worry about my feelings." He still felt Nightingale was hiding something, but because of his busy government affairs, he did not have much time to think about it, so he could only leave this be for now. 4 days after receiving Iron Axe's secret letter, the First Army of the Eastern Front Army entered the Silver City territory through the canal. It was almost the same with the trip to Redwater City. Earl William led his platoon out of town to greet them, and after a warm greeting, he followed up with a dinner invitation. The difference was that in Redwater City, they were welcomed by the city's nobles, while in the old man's platoon, there were more merchants, including their old acquaintance Hogg. That evening, the Earl's opening speech set the tone for the feast. He was willing to hand over his feudal power and fully supportive to His Majesty Roland's new government. A warm applause sounded immediately at the meeting, and the latter swallowed back the words that he had prepared to say. And through Hogg's efforts, the feast became a business fair. "Aren't you always asking me how the machine in my mine operates?" He talked proudly in front of a bunch of merchants. "Its real inventor is currently standing in front of you. It's His Majesty Roland himself. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You don't even need to go to the Western region. You can get the answer directly here in Silver City." The merchants immediately swarmed over. "Your Majesty, could you tell us why its power is so strong? If you're willing to sell more rail systems, the Damon's Chamber of Commerce is looking forward to working with Neverwinter." "Your Majesty, do you remember the Fast Sail Association? 2 years ago, we provided you with several sailing ships to transport refugees from the eastern region. In terms of trade strength, we're definitely one of the best chambers of commerce in the central region. If possible, the Fast Sail Association wishes to buy a complete set of the manufacturing equipment for a steam engine. And naturally, at a very generous price." Remembering the good news the female merchant Margaret had revealed to him, Roland did not know whether to laugh or cry. Hogg will bring a large number of merchants to the western region. Unexpectedly, he had actually met them beforehand. The world would have been such a nice place if everywhere in Grey Castle was like Silver City. After satisfying the merchant's curiosity, he finally found a chance to speak privately with the old lord. They walked through the hall and went to an open-air balcony, temporarily putting behind the buzz of the party. Roland held his wine glass, and after staring at the city for a long time, he finally said, "To hand over your city power like this, aren't you feeling any regret?" "It was never actually mine to keep, so what's to regret?" Earl William smiled. "Your father, as well as his father before him, though they never said it clearly, they would have never allowed Silver City to have its own cluster. And it's a rule for the William family to never have their own cities. As far as I'm concerned, this power isn't so important." He paused for a moment. "Not to mention that I don't actually need this power." "You don't need it?" Roland could not help but ask curiously. "The actual reason for the city of province is to expand and consolidate your power to prevent others from looking down on you. But Silver City does not have this risk. Anyone who wants to attack this city will blatantly provoke the authority of the Wimbledon royal family. So as long as my family stays loyal, I don't need to worry about getting attacked." The Earl had a sip of wine and continued, "In turn, feudal power is also in a sense a weakening of your own power. Through it, one has to allocate part of his own resources to others in order to gain their allegiance. Compared to giving out these resources to other people, I'd prefer to manage them by myself. Do you know how much the output of Silver City has increased in the past 20 years? Roland shook his head. "As much as 16 times, after all, I put most of my energy into it," the old lord said with high spirits. "At first, it was just an open-air silver mine, but right now the excavated mineral veins have reached more than 10 different kinds. In addition, at first there was only an excavation team sent by the royal family, but now, not only are there all kinds of ore and jewel merchants, but also many auxiliary industries have been developed through mining, such as oil lamp, mining shovel manufacturing, etc. Your steam engine can also be considered as one of them, am I correct?" "Indeed," Roland said with a smile. "This feeling is like raising a child and watching it slowly grow up. Why would I be willing to split and share it with others? That's why I don't need such a power." After saying that, the Earl sighed. "Your Majesty, do you wish to let me continue managing the city of shimmering silverlight for you?" "Of course, if you wish to." Roland lifted his wine glass towards him, they smiled at each other and then touched their glasses gently. "Oh right," Roland changed the subject after finishing his drink. "Do you know about the Guylan family?" "Guylan?" Earl William pondered for a while before raising his eyebrow. "I think I remember them but not very clearly. After all, it's been for a long time for a new noble family to appear in Silver City. All those families were here before the discovery of the silver mine. If I remember correctly, the last Guylan must have changed his family name 2 years ago and his land now belongs to the Somi family." When he said those words, Roland instantly felt Nightingale's grip on his arm. Chapter 877, The Long-Forgotten Hometown. He changed his family name? What happened? Roland frowned. Probably because it's easier to merge with another family than to manage the territory all by himself. William was surprised that Roland was paying particular attention to some petty noble. It requires a huge amount of money to live a decent life. If one isn't really capable of managing domestic affairs, his domain would be a burden rather than an asset. Could it be possible that he was compelled? For example, somebody wanted to take his land by force? The Earl replied meditatively, not very likely. I've seen them attend some banquets before, although I didn't really talk to them. That Guylan, who changed his surname, seems to be pretty happy with the Somas. I don't see he was forced by any means. If you want to know about this, I can send for Viscount.Somi. That's fine. Roland interrupted him after receiving Nightingale's whispery instructions. I was just curious. Not a big deal. But it appears that the Guylan didn't show up this time? He thought that Nightingale should have recognized him if his brother Hyde had attended the banquet. The senior lord clapped his hand over his chest and said apologetically, That's my fault. I usually stick to our tradition when sending out invitations. Roland immediately understood what he meant. Even though the Guylan had changed his name and become a branch of the Somas, he was still not considered for a place on the invitation list. Although the booming mining industry in Silver City stimulated commerce and trades, making the city more or less similar to City of Glow in terms of its livelihood and style, people in here apparently attached greater importance to wealth and power than titles and reputations. William's answer, in a way, also reflected that the glory and pride of the Guylan family had almost diminished and faded out of people's memories. Roland knew Hyde had inherited his father's Viscount title after the departure of Nightingale. It was really pathetic to see him be reduced to such poverty. Roland returned to the campsite. As soon as he shut the tent curtains, Nightingale revealed herself and explained voluntarily, Your Majesty, you must know that I have no interest in prying into Hyde's business. Ever since I left Silver City, I've severed all relationships with the Gylans. Please trust me. I was just a little surprised at that time. Roland could barely suppress the urge to tease Nightingale when he saw the latter try to convince him with a look of absolute honesty. Nevertheless, he soon changed his mind at the thought of Nightingale's incredible obstinacy, for he did not like to seek trouble. As such, he simply coughed and nodded airily. I know. You never lie to me in this regard. You don't believe me. Nope, you don't believe me at all. Nightingale retorted immediately. Apparently, his reply was not quite convincing, for Nightingale had discerned the mocking tone of his remark with her ability. He thus took a deep breath and cleared his mind. Then he looked into her eyes and said more seriously, I believe you. This time, it was Nightingale's turn to feel abashed. A rosy blush rose to her cheeks. She immediately looked away. I was just surprised. I have nothing to do with the person who betrayed me. Although Roland wanted to tell her that it was normal to show some concerns for her brother, he felt it more advisable to tag along in this situation. So, he asked, why were you surprised? The Somas once had a good term with my father, Nightingale replied in a low voice. After my father passed away, they often came to see me at the old Guylan mansion. However, after my family knew I'd become a witch, old Guylan forbade me to see them. I didn't expect that Viscount Somi would adopt Hyde. Roland, who had lived in this world for so many years, instantly understood the underlying implication. If the two families did have a good term, the Somas should have helped Nightingale's brother revive the house after the decease of old Guylan. Indeed, it was common for a noble to help an heir of a diminished family regain its power. The latter would then return his benefactor with incessant wealth and even further a union through the marriage of their children. It was a kind deed people loved to talk about. Yet to ask the sole heir to change his surname would be a totally different story. That meant the end of the Guylan bloodline as well as their Viscount title. Since Roland had determined to forfeit all feudal rights, the noble status did not matter anymore. However, from the point of view of a traditional noble, having an heir change his family name was far worse than stealing his property. It did not sound like something that a family with whom the Gylans had a good relationship would do. If you sense something unusual, look into it. Roland sat back at the desk and unrolled a stash of parchment to review the statistics of the local population and the financial status of the local government, a routine task that he always did when visiting a new city. Sylvie and the gods' punishment witches will protect me here. I'll be perfectly safe at the campsite, so you don't have to stick around all the time. Nightingale hesitated for a moment. But it's the business of the Gylan family. I have nothing to do with them. It's your father's domain essentially, so you're more or less involved. Plus, the mansion where you grew up is also within that domain, right? Since we've already arrived here and that the church is no longer coming after you, just take this opportunity to revisit your old abode. Although all the land now belongs to the kingdom, Roland remained the rest of his words unsaid. Nightingale appeared to be persuaded by the notion of the old mansion where she grew up. After a long silence, she made her decision. Okay, but you have to promise to summon me when you want to leave the campground. It would be a quick trip. I'm not going to do anything. You got it. Roland shook his head in amusement. He had this weird feeling that he was forcing Nightingale to return to her native town, but he believed the historical issues of her family would only be solved after she confronted them with courage. Avoidance would never help with the problems. If truth be told, Nightingale was still a little, too young to understand the philosophy of life. Nightingale left the campsite at dawn. She headed to the east of Silver City along the main street. She remembered it was a grand mansion. There was a farmland close to the two-story building, vast enough to hide all footprints. A brook, which originated from the depth of the forests, wrapped around the farmland, where she used to hunt for crabs in summer. In the farther east lay a deep ravine, which was where her families had believed a gem mine was hidden. Her family had once promised that they would pick the biggest gemstone down there as her dowry. Nightingale had not known that her family's domain was actually the smallest among nobles until she had left Silver City with the Witch Cooperation Association. Their land was pretty much of the same size as the domain of an ordinary knight if compared to nobles in other towns. Since their only water source was this brook, the expansion of the farmland was greatly limited. The so-called gem mine down the ravine was probably a pure dream of her family's. Even if the mine did exist, they would not have enough gold royals for further development and operation. This place did not change much during her prolonged absence. Although the bushy farmland both appeared to have shrunk a little bit over the past several years, the reminiscence of her childhood seemed to have brought life back to this place, making it as fresh and vivid as ever. Nightingale somehow started to understand the underlying meaning of Wendy's words. Erasing the nightmares of the old days doesn't mean abandoning the past. When Nightingale approached the mansion, however, she was astonished. She had thought the deserted house would be dilapidated, but to her dismay, it was not only refurbished but had also expanded a great deal on top of the original building. She walked through the yard fences and saw many people inside, all poorly dressed, some of them even as shabby as beggars. Several servants were passing porridge to the crowd, and the crowd, from time to time, expressed their gratitude to their benefactor. Nightingale wondered if they were distributing relief food. Over the crowd at the end of the yard, she noticed a man standing at the entrance of the mansion, smiling back to the grateful peasants. His attire and every act of demeanor revealed that he was a well-bred aristocratic gentleman. As Nightingale had expected, the man was her long-forgotten brother. Hyde Gylan. Chapter 878, Nightingale's Investigation. Based on the description of the Lord of Silver City, the fallen Gylan family should not have the financial capacity to support peasants. In other words, this Count Somi was the real philanthropist who had not only helped with the extensions of the house but had also supplied warm porridge to the poor. Nightingale didn't understand why they had chosen to take Hyde in rather than offer him aid and assistance in the revival of House Gylan as what nobles were normally encouraged to do. Nevertheless, this Count Somi did not seem like a bad man, she thought. A person who was willing to provide food to people in destitution should be, overall, generous and kind in nature. Further, Hyde, in a way, had also benefited from such a benevolent act. Even if Hyde was currently in a desperate situation, she would not interfere. She just wanted to visit her old home and indulge herself a little bit in nostalgia. When Nightingale was about to depart for other places, a strange feeling suddenly struck her. She came to a halt. Hang on, what's exactly wrong here? She surveyed the yard and frowned at the ragged peasants, the servants maintaining orders, the mansion guards, and the noble hosting the event. Hyde was not wearing a godstone of retaliation, not even the kind of the worst quality. Through the mist, she could clearly see Hyde's physical appearance and his clothing. When she rested her eyes on the guard at the entrance, however, she could only spy the scabbard at his heel, since a big black hole in front of his chest blocked her vision. Now Nightingale perceived the aberrancy. It was absolutely abnormal for an heir of a viscount not to wear any godstones of retaliation. Even the guards were wearing one. She wondered whether it was because Hyde now held an impartial and unprejudiced view of witches, but she soon denied such a possibility. She still remembered the abhorrence with which his brother had said over a decade ago, "I'd rather not have you as my sister. All witches should go to hell and be in company with demons." Even though she could not tell truth from lies with her ability back then, she knew Hyde had meant it. His eyes had betrayed everything. Nightingale then assumed that Hyde probably could not afford a godstone. It might happen to a fallen noble, but since Hyde had joined the Sommi family, he should be able to purchase one. After a moment of hesitation, Nightingale turned around and walked toward the yard. The moment she passed the mansion gate, she overheard two guards' conversation. Both of them were speaking in a suppressed voice. "Nobles are so horrific creatures. He's no better than us but just a pup used to please his lordship. Who would know he would turn into a completely different person once splendidly dressed? Is it what his lordship usually refers to as the bearing of aristocracies?" "Stop the nonsense," the other guard hooted. "His lordship is in the house right now. If somebody overhears us and tells him what you just said, you'll lose your salary this month." The previous person shrugged. "No need to worry. I have good ears. I'll know when somebody approaches. Plus, I didn't lie. He's truly a pup. Everybody, both downstairs and upstairs, has heard his lordship bellow at him in a hot red rage. You know his lordship is somewhat faulty in regard to temper, and you still try to irritate him." The other guard grunted. "No matter how ill-tempered his lordship is, he's still a noble. What about you? Are you related to anyone who bears a relatively prominent family name? Even the foreman in the neighboring village is more distinguished than you. If your uncle didn't ask me to look after you, I wouldn't have given a damn about what you say." Okay. I'll shut up." "What the heck?" The first guard suddenly stiffened. "What's the matter?" "I somehow feel someone just passed us." He looked around and then murmured, "Probably I'm just being paranoid." Ignoring the guards, Nightingale directly walked through the wall and soon located the Viscount's room based on the domain of Godstone. Normally, the higher one's status was, the better quality one's Godstone would be. Nightingale had often used this method to locate her target when she had been employed as an assassin, and her method had rarely failed. When she learned that Sommi was in here, she was dimly aware that the food distribution in the yard might not be as simple as it appeared to be. Apart from the Viscount and a fully armed knight posed as his guard, there was an old man in a robe standing in front of the desk. He looked like a scholar from the old King's City. "Lord. You shouldn't have yelled at Lord Hyde yesterday. He did submit to you, but your occasional generosity and kindness will help him play his role better." Sommi, who sat in a high-backed armchair, whacked the desk in vexation. "I know, but I can't control myself. It took me decades to get what I have. I was only this close to obtaining the 2 lands in the east, but a random order from Roland Wimbledon just shattered everything. Did you hear what that old fool said? He's willing to hand over his feudal rights and fully support His Majesty's new policy. Has it never occurred to him that other people may need those rights that he doesn't think he needs? That really pissed me off. Smile, your lordship, smile. You vented last night already. The scholar stroked his beards. Since you're so reluctant to implement the new policy, why don't you refuse to hand over your feudal rights on the spot? Dot was at a loss for words for a second. He then replied resentfully, do you think I'm in a position to defy the king? Even Timothy's royal knightage was defeated by Roland. Do you want me to die on the spot? Therefore, your complaints don't help with anything but only worsen the matter. Such being the case, do you still want to continue with this meaningless grumble? Damn. The Viscount cursed under his breath after a long silence. As His Majesty has forfeited nothing but feudal rights, you can follow the example of Earl William. As long as you properly manage your current domain, you won't suffer great losses. But without the executive power over the jurisdiction, those greedy patrol team will sooner or later come here. How am I supposed to stop them by then? Dot shook his head vigorously. You know what I sell. Once they find out, no doubt I'll be sent to the gallows. Then abandon that business, the scholar answered immediately. I've told you this isn't going to last long. Since you've already raised enough capitals and that the church no longer imposes any restrictions on you, you can now turn to some regular businesses. Why did you put so many efforts in gaining control of the Guyland family in the first place? Didn't you want to expand your territory and your authority to be in a more secure position? The Viscount was apparently having some difficulties in washing his hands of the whole matter. After hesitating for around 7 or 8 minutes, he finally gave a nod with a flash of heroism. I see. This will be the last food distribution. After Hyde is done, I'll talk to him personally. Don't just suspend the business all of a sudden, as that'll raise unwelcome suspicions. You can still do it for a short while, but just tell them not to come pick up orders again. All right. I'll do what you said. After resolving to leave what the scholar called a shady business, Dot was completely alleviated. He leaned backward in the armchair and laughed aloud. The two Gylans must have no idea what they've missed. Since they don't know about anything, I obviously become the perfect person to take care of the Guyland family. I bet Hyde still thinks his parents died in that refugee riot, doesn't he? Ha ha ha. The words enraged Nightingale so much that her pupils suddenly contracted in anger. Chapter 879, Excuse for Betrayal. Why did Somi mention the riot? It was true that many years ago, a tragic mine accident had resulted in hundreds of deaths among mine laborers. Since at that time the mine owner had only been willing to indemnify the losses for Freeman, his indifference toward those underpaid refugee workers outraged the victims' family members, which had thus led to a huge riot in Silver City. Swarms of refugees had escaped from the mining area in a fury, looting and plundering every residence coming into sight. After an extensive pillage, the riot had finally been quashed by the knightage in the king's city, and peace and order had been again restored. That was the last time she had seen her parents. It was until she and her brother had been escorted to the old Guyland mansion that they had learned the death of their parents. But now it appeared that it had not been the case, based on what the Viscount had just said. Nightingale did not expect she would overhear a completely different side of the story decades after the accident. If the Viscount was indeed telling the truth, she would have to investigate something other than the relationship between Hyde and the Somis. Nightingale exited the room quietly. She reached the basement floor and turned on the sigil of listening she took with her. The sigil was initially to facilitate the communication between her and Roland in the event Roland wanted her immediate return. She did not anticipate that she would use it on such an occasion. It did seem quite fishy. After hearing the account at the other end of the line, Roland replied. So you want to stay at the mansion a little longer? Yes, I plan to ask Hyde in person at night. Perhaps he knows something. Nightingale hesitated for a moment and then apologized. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. No need to apologize. Roland quickly interrupted her. I'll wait for you at the camp while you're conducting your investigation. Don't worry, it's very safe in here. As long as I stay in, I'm not breaking the promise. You need to take care of yourself and stay safe. Don't act rashly. No matter what you discover, you have to report to me every 4 hours. Nightingale felt the warmth of Roland's words wash over her. After a moment of silence, she replied in a soft voice, "Yes, I understand." When the moonlight faded away outside the skylight, Nightingale left the cellar for Hyde's room. She had confirmed the location of her brother's room earlier. The slant of the moonlight indicated it was midnight, a perfect time for her to take action, for most people were in a deep slumber at this hour, and even vigil guards sometimes dozed off in the dead of the night. Hyde's bedroom was on the first floor of the mansion close to the backyard, a place usually for servants or insignificant guests. This room arrangement further corroborated the testimonies of the two guards. It not only showed that Viscount did not take the heir of House Guyland very seriously but also suggested that all the kindness the Somis had perpetrated in the past was feigned. Due to Hyde's low status in the household, the entire hall and the hallway were unguarded, which provided Nightingale ample time to escape in case of an emergency. After entering the bedroom, Nightingale dragged her brother out of bed straight away. Before Hyde completely woke up and realized what had happened, he felt the chill of a dagger around his throat. "Any screams, cries or wailings will bring you an instant death. You got it?" Nightingale whispered behind Hyde. Hyde nodded immediately. "Very well. Now turn around and look who I am." Hyde soon submitted to Nightingale's order. His pupils dilated instantly after he figured out who the assassin was in the dismal moonlight. If it was not because of the dagger to his throat, he would have shrieked. But he managed to keep silent. Nightingale slowly withdrew the dagger after making sure that her brother was tranquilized. Why are you here?" Hyde could barely suppress the tremor in his voice. "Didn't you die a long time ago?" The moment Hyde spoke, his words resurrected all the thin threads of her old bitter memories. For a second, Nightingale felt as though she were in the old Guyland mansion again. The revived pain of the betrayal from her own brother and the agony of being abused and used by her remote relatives blurred her vision and perturbed her mind. This is the person who exposed the most tender part of her heart to vicious strangers. Nightingale bit her tongue to let the smell of the blood disperse the multitude of thoughts in her head. She asked, "Why did you say that?" Because, Hyde swallowed hard. Timothy searched the entire King City and the surrounding towns. He announced that all witches were executed. "But Veronica, sister. I don't want you to die." I was shocked at the news at that time as well. I thought if you didn't leave by yourself, you probably wouldn't have been persecuted. Veronica, thought Nightingale. It was a name she had not used for years. However, after years of self-improvement and personal training, she was no longer as gullible as she used to be. The tremulous magic power inside her body had told her that the latter half of Hyde's speech was a complete lie. "Why are you with Viscount Somi?" Well, Hyde paused for a second. After the death of old Guyland, there were constant disputes within the family. I didn't know much about the details, but by the time I was about to inherit the title, there were not much savings in the household. It was at that time that the Viscount called on me. He basically didn't leave me many choices. Lying. Did he force you to join the Somi family? Yes. He said if I didn't agree, he would weed me out. Lying. Then what are you doing for him at present? Nightingale asked nonchalantly. Are you helping peasants? No. Hyde gritted his teeth. He's just using me to sell Dreamland water. There are rats disguised as peasants coming here to pick up orders. I didn't discover his scheme until very recently. The first half was true, while the second was still a lie. Nightingale found she was not annoyed but actually quite relieved. This was the exact feeling when she normally communicated with strangers. Lies and truth always went together, and people were always treacherous and weaselly. Sometimes, even a blood-related tended to be unreliable and deceitful. Ever since her awakening, Nightingale had been used to the caprice of human nature. Over the past few years, she had developed the ability to grasp the truth out of a bunch of lies through threats and coaxing while remaining unperturbed at the same time. As such, she actually felt uneasy to speak with Roland sometimes, for the latter rarely lied to her. Now, the shadow killer who had once made nobles in the central region tremble returned. What's your plan next? Hearing these words, Hyde suddenly prostrated to the floor and implored Nightingale, "Please help me, sister." "Help you?" Hyde crawled forward. "I know I was wrong, but I'm your brother. The Viscount never views me as a real noble. You've seen it. He puts me in this servant's room. The renovation of the mansion is just to fool the public. If I continue to stay here, he would sooner or later kill me. So you want me to get you out of here? Get out of here? Then I'll lose everything, won't I?" Hyde shook his head in a fright. He then pronounced his words through his teeth. "You killed old Guylan, didn't you? I don't know what ability you've employed, but you can easily get in here, so you must know how to enter his bedroom. Sister, kill him. Once he's dead, I'll have a chance to become a real noble of the Somi family. After that, you can kill the other successors one after another. By that time, I'll own this domain, and all the properties of the Somis." Nightingale looked into his eyes. When Hyde could no longer bear the awkward silence, she ventured. "Before that, I want to ask you a question." Sure, responded her brother instantly. "Why did you betray me back then?" Nightingale stressed each word with due strength. Chapter 880, Destitute. The answer came faster than she had anticipated. "Why?" Hyde did not reply immediately. "Just because you're a witch." There was no reaction of the magic string, which indicated that Hyde was telling the truth. In a second, Nightingale seemed to understand many things. The notion that witches were devil's minions and the representation of the fallen was so permeated among the public that people no longer viewed a person as a human being once she turned into a witch. The dehumanization process had thus further given rise to an alienation between the brother and sister. The so-called betrayal was simply an automatic self-protection mechanism. Perhaps, Hyde still believed he had done the right thing, and that was why he could blurt out his response so naturally. Afterwards, Hyde said something else. He reproached himself for his ignorance and claimed that he had not known the rumor about witches was a fabrication created by the church. He also said he had truly repented for his sin and hoped that Nightingale could forgive him. Nightingale, however, could not really register his words, for she was still absorbed in her own thoughts. So she shouldn't blame Hyde because everyone would have made the same decision under the same circumstances? For Hyde, he was not betraying his own sister but a demon who would sooner or later lose all her attachments to humanity. Since he thought she was a demon, there was no trust between them whatsoever. But, is it really true for everyone? Nightingale thought of another person, although she was currently confronting Hyde. That person was also a noble. If exposing a witch was a matter of course, he should have sent Anna, a witch to whom he was not related and had never met before, to the gallows a long time ago. He did not fear witches, nor did he hate them, but was simply curious. His eyes were always so clear that she could always easily see through his mind. He had remained open to her even when she had held a knife to his throat. All the memories came flooding back. Nightingale then remembered that snowy day. It was the first winter after their encounter. "I don't think she'll die during the months of demons." "Why?" "She said she wouldn't lose to the demonic torture, and I believe her." "You even believe a witch?" "We're cursed by demons." "Really?" "I believe you, too." The pictures in her head faded away. Nightingale took a deep breath and pulled herself back to the reality. "Wait here. If anybody comes to look for you, do what you normally do like I've never shown up." Hold on. Where are you going?" She put the dagger back to her waist and stepped into the mist. "To do what I should do." Nightingale knew Hyde was right. She could easily invade Viscount Somi's bedroom and threaten him to spit out all the truth with a dagger. Most nobles would lose their minds at the sight of a sharp blade and automatically disclose everything without further coercion. Some stubborn ones, however, might insist on their silence for a while, but would eventually pour their hearts out after she denailed their 10 fingers. This was a theory she had developed after years of assassination experience. If the death of her parents did have something to do with the Viscount, she would definitely make him pay with his life. Yet Nightingale did not want a brutal revenge at this moment. especially after she confronted Hyde. She was now no longer alone. She had a person she could trust her life with and a person who equally trusted her. Compared to the traditional method employed by her as a shadow killer, Nightingale intended to solve the problem in an alternative way. She believed if it were Roland, he would definitely not want to see her cause so much bloodshed. Nightingale walked out of the mist and entered Dot's study. Several pitch-dark black holes, which resembled inky spheres, appeared in the black and white world. Ignoring the dozing guards at the door, she rested her eyes on the domain of God's stone next to the bookshelf. Nightingale slowly walked to the wall, and the wall soon twisted and distorted. The outline of the wall curled up like dry, tangled hair, revealing what was hidden beneath. Through the distortion, Nightingale could perceive the details that eyes of ordinary people could not penetrate. She saw a metal rod hidden in the wall, one end connecting to the bookshelf and the other attached to a black ball. It was a very common trap. Nightingale broke the bell hung below the trap effortlessly. She then picked an ordinary-looking book and pushed it. Without a sound, the trapdoor was open. The secret vault was embedded with God's stones of retaliation, but that did not pose an issue to her. Before she had entered her adulthood, old Guylan had hired a rat leader to teach her all the skills that should be possessed by an experienced, cunning thief. After years of training, she had learned every deft trick of burglary, including how to open various lock catches with a copper needle. After breaking open 3 or 4 iron vaults, Nightingale found what she wanted. It was a recent ledger that kept a record of all the Dreamland water transactions, including the order number, the name of the purchaser, and the quantity of the stocks for each transaction. As she had expected, nobles tended to hide important stuff somewhere they believed was most secure. Both the ledger and the stocks in the mansion would provide solid evidence of the Viscount's crimes. Nightingale returned to the basement and reported everything to Roland. The following day, when it was scarcely past dawn, the First Army who had received instructions surrounded the whole mansion. 3 days later, when Hyde was just released from the prison, Nightingale came to him again. His frame was emaciated and his countenance expressed a deeper despondence. Wan and lost, he looked like a walking dead. It was the presence of Nightingale that finally brought some color to his cheeks. There was a tinge of anger and hatred in his eyes. Viscount Somey is going to be hanged. His family members were sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. The 2 domains of his were subject to civil forfeiture. This is what you want me to have? After they entered an empty alley, Hyde could not contain himself anymore. He growled at Nightingale, "You snatched everything from me and left me nothing. You should feel fortunate that you haven't been treated as a member of the Somey family." Nightingale said placidly, "Compared to the Viscount, you're at least alive. That's because you want to see me continue to suffer, to live as laughingstock. You ruined my life 8 years ago, and you did it again now. Do you know what life I had after you killed old Guylan? I finally got a chance to obtain the Somas lands, and you ruined it. I was a fool to believe you would help me." Hyde clenched his fist. "Now, I've no title, no land. Are you happy now? You've never forgiven me, Veronica. You're such a liar, you just want revenge. I should have known it long before." His hysterical hollering, in the end, yielded to a suppressed sob. He curled up his body and started to weep. "I've got nothing, nothing." Nightingale was silent for a while before she spoke. "You're right. I've never forgiven you, and I never will. A betrayal from a sibling is more intolerable than one from a stranger." She paused for a moment and then continued, "But you do have something. At least, I've given you freedom." Hyde looked up, his face covered with dirt and snot. "Nobody, neither old Guylan nor the Somas, can manipulate you now. Whatever path you choose in the future, whatever you're doing, they'll be solely on your own decision. You'll no longer live like a puppet as you did in the past. Whether you think it's a punishment or a torture, I don't care. That's your own choice, we're officially done as of today." With these words, Nightingale turned around and headed to the end of the alley before she disappeared from Hyde's sight a minute later.